It is often overlooked that there are anomalous lacunae within the timeline of human civilization. Entire centuries have seemingly vanished from European records, leaving no documented events or discernible traces. Furthermore, some ancient civilizations demonstrably possessed profound knowledge of astronomy, architecture, and mathematics, capabilities far exceeding what their historical period would suggest. Yet, these achievements are scarcely acknowledged in conventional academic texts. This raises a fundamental inquiry. Who determines what is preserved in collective memory and what is consigned to oblivion? The undeniable truth is that powerful entities have consistently influenced and shaped the collective consciousness of humanity. They have systematically engaged in the burning of books, the suppression of knowledge, dissemination, and the destruction of libraries. Such actions were not born of ignorance, but rather from a profound understanding that knowledge confers power. The control of memory dictates the present, and by mastering the present, one invariably molds the future. Consequently, what is presented to us today as history is, in many instances, a meticulously curated narrative, a story that has been edited, revised, and occasionally entirely rewritten. The deeper truths remain concealed beneath layers of forgotten time, hidden in ancient ruins, sequestered in forbidden manuscripts, and perhaps residing within the recesses of our own subconscious, an innate sense that certain elements of our past feel incomplete, a feeling we have seldom been encouraged to question. Should one resonate with this intuitive apprehension that the historical record is flawed, one is poised to delve into these forgotten mysteries. The most potent truths are often those deliberately obscured, yet they persistently await rediscovery. When contemplating history, a common perception is that of a continuous, linear progression, akin to an unbroken film, unspooling from antiquity to the contemporary era. However, a closer examination reveals profound anomalies, silent gaps. These periods exhibit an absence of significant architectural construction, remarkable technological innovations, or reliable historical documentation, merely an expansive void. Curiously, this emptiness is often disregarded, as if nothing exceptional occurred. One of the most perplexing of these discontinuities is the so-called missing century, spanning from 614 to 714 AD. This 100-year interval has left virtually no historical footprint. Few events were recorded, and there is a conspicuous lack of discernible developments in art, architecture, philosophy, or political structures. Even the emperors purported to have reigned during this period, if mentioned at all, are linked to vague and unsubstantiated timelines. A controversial hypothesis, known as the phantom time hypothesis, proposes that this entire era may have been deliberately fabricated and inserted into the historical record by powerful figures of the time. Proponents suggest that Emperor Otto III and Pope Sylvester II may have manipulated the calendar to establish the year 1000 AD as a symbolically significant milestone, thus legitimizing the rise of a divinely ordained empire. If validated, this theory would imply that humanity operates within a fundamentally altered historical timeline. While not officially recognized by mainstream historians, this proposition raises a pertinent question that warrants serious consideration. Why do extended periods of human history appear to be absent from the record? These historical lacunae are not confined to the 7th century. Across ancient civilizations in the Middle East, Africa, and Asia, there are stretches of hundreds of years for which maps, administrative records, or newly discovered architecture are conspicuously absent. It is as though an entire epoch has been deliberately obscured. If one posits that such gaps are merely the result of records decaying over time, then the fate of the Library of Alexandria provides a compelling counterexample. Once revered as the preeminent center of knowledge in the ancient world, it housed hundreds of thousands of manuscripts from a vast array of civilizations, not only Greek works, but also Egyptian, Persian, Indian, Chinese, and even long-lost texts from Mesopotamia. It served as a global nexus where scholars converged to share and preserve wisdom. Yet, this unparalleled repository was consumed by fire. The exact perpetrators remain debated. Some attribute responsibility to Caesar's army, others to religious zealots, while still others suggest its destruction occurred over centuries as part of a systematic endeavor to eradicate knowledge deemed uncontrollable. The more profound inquiry, however, is the motivation behind the burning of books. If knowledge is enlightenment, why extinguish its flame? If a library safeguards the past, why incinerate memory? It was not because these manuscripts contained falsehoods, but precisely because they challenged the established narrative that certain powers wished to promulgate. A blank space in the historical record is rarely a mere oversight. It can be the consequence of a deliberate act. The burning of a library, the prohibition of documentation, or the erasure of an entire civilization from the historical map may leave no physical scars of battle, but they inflict deep and lasting wounds upon the collective memory of humankind. If entire centuries can vanish, it compels us to consider how many other memories remain intentionally concealed. When engaging with any historical text, there is an inherent tendency to assume its veracity. However, truth, much like light, only manifests where an individual or institution chooses to illuminate a specific narrative. History, fundamentally, is not independent of power. From the very inception of written language, those who wielded the pen also commanded the authority to shape memory. Consequently, the essential question has never solely been what happened, but rather who authored this account and what did they intend for us to remember. For millennia, power and knowledge were inextricably linked, often for the purpose of retention rather than widespread dissemination. Empires, whether Eastern or Western, shared a common characteristic. They meticulously recorded only that which served their survival and ideological consolidation. A military defeat was recharacterized as a strategic withdrawal. A provincial rebellion was denounced as an insurrection. A more advanced rival civilization was dismissed as barbaric and subsequently expunged from the historical consciousness. Religion, too, frequently served as a formidable gatekeeper of knowledge. Books were not incinerated because they were perceived as meaningless, but because they contained ideas that directly challenged established doctrine. Throughout the medieval centuries, only texts approved by the ecclesiastical authorities were permitted to circulate. Any dissenting thought, even a simple inquiry, was branded as heresy. As the world transitioned into modernity, the filtering, categorization, and control of knowledge persisted, albeit through more subtle systemic means: the educational system, the academic establishment, the publishing industry, and research funding mechanisms. Each of these systems establishes its own criteria for what is deemed scientific, reliable, or valuable. Anything outside this prescribed framework is often relegated to a marginalized category, dismissed as lacking evidence, credibility, or merit. However, a critical question remains largely unaddressed. Who establishes these standards, and why are we so often discouraged from scrutinizing them? Students are taught from curricula meticulously drafted by committees, which in turn are approved by national education systems. This cyclical process perpetuates what can be termed a curated memory, not necessarily because of active deception, but because the entire edifice permits only that which aligns with the pre-existing narrative. Consequently, elements that do not conform are not overtly rejected, they are simply ignored. There is no debate, no rebuttal, merely silence. And as history demonstrates, that which is never spoken of slowly ceases to exist, much like an unnamed room within a familiar structure. This compels us to ask, do subsequent generations possess the right to reopen these doors? Do we dare to inquire whether we are engaging with objective history, or merely a sanctioned version? And if a memory has been systematically erased, who possesses the authority to decree its forgotten status? One might examine antique maps and encounter an unfamiliar name, Tartaria, which once encompassed a significant portion of northern Eurasia. On numerous European maps from the 16th to 18th centuries, Tartaria is distinctly delineated, extending from Russia's eastern frontiers to the borders of China and deep into Central Asia. It was not a nebulous frontier or unexplored wilderness. It possessed defined borders, cities, territorial divisions, and a populace. Why then is this entity virtually unknown today? Tartaria is conspicuously absent from school textbooks. There are no official lessons on its political systems, culture, or language. Major museums do not exhibit its artifacts. In the collective consciousness of most individuals, it simply never existed. Yet, the lingering traces of Tartaria are not as faint as one might assume. Across both Europe and Asia, architectural structures exhibit striking congruency in style, displaying technical features that appear to transcend the expected capabilities of their era. Massive stone columns, grand domes, arched windows, and even concealed electrical systems embedded within walls suggest remnants of a unified architectural logic neither random nor isolated. Indeed, many government buildings, museums, and train stations constructed during the 18th and 19th centuries in disparate nations share identical designs, proportions, and decorative motifs, despite lacking any apparent cultural connection. Some independent researchers posit that these structures are surviving relics of Tartaria, subsequently repurposed by later governments, their original functions altered, and new designations applied. Naturally, those who venture to inquire about Tartaria are often dismissed as purveyors of conspiracy theories. However, a pattern emerges. Whenever a civilization is labeled a myth, the avenue for genuine exploration is effectively sealed. Was Tartaria a veritable empire, or merely a broad geographic designation employed by early Europeans for unmapped territories? The answer remains elusive. Nevertheless, instead of pursuing comprehensive investigation, contemporary historiography has chosen to avert its gaze. No inquiry, no instruction, no debate, merely deletion. Tartaria is not an isolated case. Should one inquire about the northern Mesopotamian cultures, the Andean civilizations preceding the Inca, or the medieval African kingdoms that engaged in trade with Arabia and India, one is often met with blank incomprehension. This is not due to a lack of interest among younger generations, but because these narratives have simply not been imparted. Over time, that which remains unspoken begins to dissolve from existence. A civilization absent from textbooks gradually recedes from collective memory. Yet, human memory is not as easily effaced as a curriculum entry. It leaves behind lacunae, vague intuitions, unarticulated questions, and occasionally, that quiet resonance of having seen this somewhere before, a potent signal that a segment of history awaits its rediscovery. Perhaps no name in ancient history incites more scholarly debate than Atlantis. Described as a city of concentric circles, interlaced with canals, possessing advanced defensive systems, abundant resources, and architecture far ahead of its time, this flourishing society purportedly vanished in a single cataclysmic day, leaving no discernible trace. The primary accounts of Atlantis originate from Plato's renowned dialogues, Timaeus and Critias, composed around 360 BCE. Plato depicted Atlantis as a formidable civilization that challenged ancient Athens before being swallowed by the sea in a singular day and night of misfortune. Many scholars promptly assert that Plato was a philosopher, not a historian, suggesting he employed Atlantis as an allegory, a cautionary tale regarding moral decay and unchecked power. However, if this were merely a symbolic narrative, why does the account contain such a wealth of technical details? Plato did not merely describe Atlantis abstractly. He meticulously provided the proportions of its rings, the width of its canals, and the metals utilized, including a mysterious substance called orichalcum. This metal was long considered mythical until a similar alloy was recently discovered in a sunken ship off the coast of Sicily, raising a disquieting inquiry. What if Plato was recounting historical fact? And if so, why has the prevailing global consensus insisted on its classification as a myth? Similar to Tartaria, once a narrative is relegated to the category of legend, it ceases to be treated as a subject worthy of serious investigation, transforming into a bedtime story rather than a historical lead. This categorization, however, does not preclude its reality. Over the past century, countless theories have been advanced regarding the true location of Atlantis off the coast of Gibraltar, beneath the Caribbean Sea, even in Antarctica or the Sahara Desert. Each proposed site presents a degree of corroborating evidence alongside an equal measure of counter-arguments. The peculiar aspect is that as more evidence surfaces, the narrative of Atlantis appears to be pushed further into the realm of myth. Why this paradoxical resistance? Perhaps if Atlantis did exist, and if it indeed possessed knowledge beyond its era, the origins of human civilization might not commence in Mesopotamia or Egypt, as currently taught. This would necessitate a fundamental re-evaluation of the entire historical timeline. Such a paradigm shift is not readily accepted by all, as history is not merely a chronicle of the past. It forms the bedrock of our worldview, defining our concepts of progress, science, and civilization. If a prior, advanced civilization existed and subsequently disappeared, it challenges our perception of contemporary humanity, standing at an evolutionary apex. This potential intellectual upheaval may be precisely why Atlantis has been interred, not solely beneath the waves, but beneath layers of deliberate doubt. While no overt prohibition exists against researching Atlantis, academic warnings against taking legends too seriously effectively stifle further inquiry. If history is an incomplete puzzle, then perhaps the narratives we dismiss as legends are, in fact, the crucial missing pieces. Among all ancient civilizations referenced in academic curricula, Egypt consistently maintains prominence. The imagery of pharaohs, pyramids, the Sphinx, and the Nile River is deeply embedded in the global consciousness. Yet, a curious dichotomy exists. The more we are taught about Egypt, the less we appear to genuinely comprehend what transpired. This is largely because the historical discourse is encapsulated within a fixed narrative, portraying ancient Egyptians as industrious agriculturalists who incrementally built an empire through sustained labor. However, a rigorous examination of their monumental legacy causes this theory to falter. Consider the pyramids of Giza, 3 colossal structures in the desert, each constructed from multi-ton stone blocks, stacked with millimeter precision and without mortar. Their angles are near perfect, aligning closely with Earth's axial tilt. The base of the Great Pyramid of Giza aligns almost precisely with the planet's prime meridian, with a margin of error under 0.05 degrees. Furthermore, the layout of the pyramids reflects the positions of the 3 stars in the Orion constellation with astonishing accuracy. To dismiss this as mere coincidence requires considerable credulity, especially given that contemporary engineers, utilizing cranes, heavy-duty trucks, and laser-guided positioning systems, cannot replicate the precision achieved by these so-called ancient farmers millennia ago. A discrepancy clearly exists. Many independent researchers have posed a pertinent inquiry. Did the ancient Egyptians actually construct the pyramids, or were they merely the inheritors of pre-existing structures? There is no record whatsoever in ancient Egyptian texts describing the construction of the Great Pyramid. No blueprints, no discernible tools left behind, no documents naming an architect. This towering edifice, now one of Earth's most iconic, remains entirely anonymous in its origin. This is merely one example. The ancient Egyptians possessed astronomical knowledge far exceeding their era. They understood Earth's axial tilt, meticulously tracked the Sirius star cycle, and calculated the length of the year with a margin of error under 0.25 days. A level of precision modern science only recently corroborated with advanced technology. They practiced sound-based healing, performed mummification using chemical compounds that remain unreplicated today, and carved granite, a material harder than iron, with methods that defy current explanation. Why then are these facts not routinely taught in standard history classes? Why are serious questions regarding the extent of Egyptian knowledge frequently dismissed as fringe speculation? It is plausible that acknowledging their possession of advanced technology would necessitate a fundamental re-evaluation of the entire arc of human evolution. Such timeless knowledge potentially disrupts the neat, linear narrative of humanity's gradual ascent from savagery to civilization. And, more importantly, if such profound knowledge once existed, who imparted it? The ancient Egyptians consistently spoke of gods who instructed them in building, healing, agriculture, and astronomy. Yet, in modern interpretations, these accounts are often relegated to mere mythology, overlooking the possibility that these gods may have been symbolic representations of a prehistoric civilization that vanished without a trace. Egypt did not attempt to conceal its history. It meticulously carved everything in stone for future generations. However, those who subsequently retold the story chose to relate only a fraction of it. The untold part, preserved in silence, may well hold the key to revelations we have scarcely dared to imagine. Major technological advancements are frequently attributed exclusively to the modern world, founded on the assumption that contemporary humanity alone possesses the requisite tools and knowledge to construct magnificent wonders. However, a dispassionate analysis of certain ancient structures reveals an unsettling truth. They do not align with the established timeline of human evolution. They appear as artifacts from a future epoch, anachronistically placed in the distant past. Returning to the familiar pyramids of Giza, these geometric, astronomical, and engineering marvels have endured for millennia without collapse. To this day, no one has succeeded in replicating their construction using presumed ancient methods, and no explicit Egyptian record elucidates their building process. Moving beyond the deserts of Egypt, across the ocean to South America, one encounters Puma Punku, an astonishing and largely unacknowledged complex nestled high in the Bolivian Andes, over 3,800 meters above sea level. Pumapunku consists of massive stone blocks, weighing hundreds of tons, cut with laser-like precision, featuring perfectly symmetrical H-shaped grooves. Some blocks interlock with such exactitude that they resemble components from a modern industrial assembly line. Yet, the site dates back over 1,000 years, to a period when Andean peoples reportedly did not even possess the wheel. The methodology for cutting granite and diorite stones harder than steel without hardened metal tools remains unknown, and remarkably, this fundamental question is almost entirely absent from historical texts. Further afield, in modern-day Turkey, lies Göbekli Tepe, a site that has compelled archaeologists to fundamentally revise the timeline of human architecture. Discovered in the 1990 seconds, Göbekli Tepe is over 11,000 years old, predating the pyramids of Giza and Stonehenge. It features dozens of massive T-shaped stone pillars, each exceeding 5 meters in height, intricately carved with animal symbols. All this was constructed at a time when, according to mainstream historical accounts, humans were still nomadic hunter-gatherers dwelling in caves, with no concept of organized religion or permanent temples. The identity of Göbekli Tepe's builders remains unknown. Consequently, the site is often categorized as an enigmatic anomaly, acknowledged but not permitted to disrupt the official historical narrative. When these three sites, the pyramids of Egypt, Pumapunku, and Göbekli Tepe, are considered collectively, a singular conclusion emerges. They defy the linear progression of technological development we have been taught. They exhibit advanced technology for their respective eras, provide no clear record of their constructors, involve no known tools capable of the precision observed, and do not align with the assumed level of civilization for their time. Perhaps most tellingly, their extraordinary nature is consistently downplayed in official explanations. To admit that advanced civilizations existed long before our modern age would necessitate a radical rethinking of human history, suggesting not a straight line of progress, but perhaps a cyclical pattern of ascent, collapse, rebuilding, and subsequent forgetting. Instead of confronting this possibility, the prevailing system often chooses to avert its gaze, labeling such phenomena as unexplained or mythological, thereby preserving the illusion that history is a settled domain. Yet, with every uncut stone, every unreplicated structure, every monument whose assigned age defies logic, there echoes a quiet assertion: an entire chapter of our own story remains unread. The Vatican is often revered as a global symbol of faith, the epicenter of Roman Catholicism, and a sacred locus of profound spiritual influence. However, a seldom explored facet reveals it as home to one of humanity's most extensive and secretive repositories of knowledge. Shielded behind the fortified portals of the Vatican Apostolic Archive, formerly known as the Vatican Secret Archive, lie over 85 kilometers of shelving. These shelves are laden with millions of documents, letters, maps, ancient manuscripts, diplomatic records, and historical writings, some dating back to the 8th century. Among these are handwritten letters from luminaries like Michelangelo and Galileo, edicts condemning heresy, ancient astronomical texts, and even records from the Roman Empire prior to its dissolution. Crucially, the vast majority of this collection is inaccessible to individuals outside the Vatican. Only a select few scholars are granted restricted access to very limited sections for brief periods, always under strict supervision. Photography is prohibited, documents may not leave the premises, and profound inquiries are subtly discouraged. This stringent control raises a pertinent inquiry. Why does a religious institution maintain such immense collections of global historical knowledge? And more importantly, why is it guarded with such unparalleled secrecy? The explanation, as often proves to be the case, transcends purely religious motivations. It is fundamentally about the power of knowledge. For centuries, the Vatican has functioned as a formidable gatekeeper of information. When ancient scientific discoveries contradicted ecclesiastical doctrine, they were labeled heresy. Pagan texts challenging religious order were incinerated. Cosmic theories threatening the geocentric model led to the condemnation of their proponents, such as Giordano Bruno, who was burned at the stake in 1600 for positing an infinite universe replete with countless worlds. While the Vatican is not unique in its history of censorship, it stands as one of the oldest and most secretive institutions, possessing the capacity to shape humanity's recollection of its own past, not through overt prohibitions, but by meticulously dictating what is permitted to be known and what is not. In the contemporary world, where information appears ubiquitous, it is tempting to assume that secrets are an anachronism. However, the most profound secrets remain sequestered in archives accessible only to their designated guardians. This singular characteristic distinguishes the Vatican. It does not merely conceal truth, but wields the authority to determine which truths remain untold. Might these documents contain references to forgotten prehistoric civilizations? Could there be texts from Egypt, Babylon, or even Atlantis that the world has never encountered? Do ancient maps perhaps delineate lands that no longer exist or were never publicly acknowledged? The answers remain unknown, for confronting this immense repository means confronting an impenetrable barrier of closed doors. Once again, history emerges as a narrative exclusively controlled by those who hold the key. In a world where words serve as the primary vessel for humanity's collective memory, knowledge, and aspirations, the act of burning books represents perhaps the most extreme assault on intelligence itself. It is poignant to reflect upon the sheer number of intellectual conflagrations throughout human history. From the Library of Alexandria to the destruction of Maya codices, from ancient Chinese classics to texts proscribed during the Renaissance, history is replete with instances where knowledge was deemed dangerous and consequently annihilated. One of the most devastating intellectual tragedies ever recorded is the burning of the Library of Alexandria. Once acclaimed as the greatest center of knowledge in the ancient world, it housed hundreds of thousands of manuscripts spanning mathematics, astronomy, philosophy, medicine, and radical ideas that, had they survived, might have fundamentally reshaped civilization. Yet, almost all of it was lost due to war, rebellion, and neglect. The precise instigators of the fire remain disputed. Some implicate Julius Caesar, others Roman generals, religious authorities, or a protracted series of destructive events over centuries. What is certain, however, is the permanence of this loss. This phenomenon was not confined to Egypt. In the Americas, upon the arrival of the Spanish in Maya lands, they encountered a culture possessing its own sophisticated script, calendar, and a remarkably precise body of astronomical knowledge. Yet, within a few short years, the majority of Maya codices were incinerated, condemned as heresy. Father Diego de Landa, an early European chronicler of the Maya, personally ordered the destruction of hundreds of sacred texts, later lamenting that no one could subsequently comprehend the Maya, an irony that constitutes one of history's deepest tragedies. In Asia, during the reign of Qin Shi Huang in ancient China, a state-sanctioned book burning and scholar purge occurred in the name of ideological unity. Approximately 460 scholars were executed, and books from rival schools of thought were destroyed. Any knowledge, philosophical, medical, astronomical, that did not align with the empire's doctrine was systematically eradicated. However, the censorship of knowledge did not cease in ancient times. During the Renaissance, as thinkers began to challenge the prevailing ecclesiastical version of truth, an infamous index emerged, the Index Librorum Prohibitorum, the Index of Forbidden Books. This list included names now revered, such as Galileo, Copernicus, Spinoza, and Descartes, whose works were once branded as perilous to human faith and soul. Even more peculiar, some books were never burned, but instead concealed or disappeared under mysterious circumstances. An ancient manuscript detailing anti-gravity architecture from the Greek era vanished. A map depicting an ice-free Antarctica disappeared. Legends of flying machines in ancient Indian texts were dismissed without investigation. All such accounts hover at the blurry frontier between myth and reality, relegated to the shadows through collective silence. In a world where information is power, the choice of what is preserved and what is incinerated is never accidental. It is a deliberate decision regarding what humanity is permitted to remember and what it is compelled to forget. While the full extent of what was lost may never be known, one truth is undeniable. The history of humankind was not only inscribed in ink, but also erased by fire. The progression of modern science is frequently characterized as a linear ascent from ignorance to enlightenment, from superstition to rational inquiry. Yet, a closer examination of this trajectory reveals intriguing discrepancies. Numerous forms of ancient knowledge were discarded, not because they were demonstrably false, but because they failed to conform to the dominant worldview of their respective eras. Whenever a concept is labeled heretical or superstitious, the underlying motivation is often less about logical rigor and more about the exercise of power. Consider, for example, traditional medicine. Long before the advent of modern pharmacology, ancient civilizations in India, Egypt, China, and Greece developed sophisticated healing systems, often far exceeding what we typically associate with their epochs. Egyptians employed sound frequencies for therapeutic purposes. Ancient Indian texts describe intricate brain surgeries performed over 2 millennia ago, and the Chinese meticulously mapped energy meridians centuries before the invention of the microscope. However, with the rise of modern rational science, these practices were largely dismissed, lacking chemical formulas, microscopic validation, or quantifiable data. They were summarily branded as superstition. A similar pattern emerged in ancient astronomy. The Babylonians, Maya, and Egyptians all developed calendars of astonishing accuracy, some tracking stellar cycles, astronomical events, and Earth's axial tilt with a precision that modern science only recently confirmed with advanced technology. These ancient cultures relied upon observation, intuition, and accumulated wisdom spanning centuries. Yet, with the dawn of modern cosmology, championed by figures like Copernicus and Galileo, this entire corpus of ancient knowledge was effectively shelved as myth. The crucial question of how these civilizations attained such accuracy was seldom posed. Their findings were simply dismissed because their methodologies were not recognized within the new scientific paradigm. Subsequently, knowledge pertaining to non-material energy concepts, ranging from life force to biofields, and psychic phenomena faced similar marginalization. If something could not be measured by prevailing instruments or empirically proven in a laboratory setting, it was deemed unscientific. Once again, valuable knowledge was pushed aside, not due to its inherent falsity, but because it did not conform to the established intellectual framework. The critical question then becomes, who defines this framework? For centuries, scientific development has not occurred in isolation. It has been shaped, and often influenced, by powerful institutions: the church, academic academies, governments, and corporate entities. Science was encouraged when it served exploration, but stifled when it dared to ask inconvenient questions. Galileo's heliocentric model led to his condemnation. Alchemists advocating the transmutation of lead into gold were derided as madmen, only for modern inorganic chemistry to demonstrate its theoretical possibility. Individuals claiming to heal through energy were dismissed as charlatans. The profound irony is that many ideas once branded as heresy are now embraced as cutting-edge science. The fundamental issue has rarely been the idea itself, but rather the authority to determine which ideas are permitted to exist. When ancient knowledge is buried, it is often supplanted by a form of knowledge that is more easily controlled, a knowledge that prioritizes production, warfare, and consumption over healing, connection, and a deeper understanding of human identity. Therefore, the inquiry extends beyond merely asking why ancient knowledge was discarded. It compels us to consider who ultimately benefits when humanity forgets what it once knew. When considering ancient civilizations, the prevalent imagery often conjures kings, empires, warriors, invasions, and rigidly defined hierarchies, almost invariably male-dominated. From pharaohs to emperors, popes, tsars, and supreme leaders, these titles reverberate through history, and nearly all are associated with men. However, by stepping back, far beyond the confines of official history, one begins to discern enigmatic artifacts, small stone statues, intricate carvings, and recurring symbols across the ancient world that depict the Mother Goddess. From the Venus of Willendorf in Europe to earth goddesses in Anatolia, and from the stone idols of the Indus Valley to the goddesses of the Maya, these representations emerge from a period preceding recorded civilization. They do not portray women as passive or fragile. Rather, they embody figures of immense power, creation, fertility, and cosmic presence, an image of the universe viewed through the lens of life, not domination. It is conceivable that prior to the establishment of societies founded on empires, hierarchies, and warfare, humanity may have lived under a different paradigm, a matriarchal structure where power was centered around the mother, and religion revolved around birth, nourishment, and connection, rather than conquest. This hypothesis is not vague or mythical. It is supported by the extensive research of numerous archaeologists, notably Marija Gimbutas, who described an era spanning thousands of years wherein communities existed peacefully, devoid of fortresses or weapons. with women at the core of both cultural and spiritual life. Suddenly, this model vanished from the official historical record. School curricula contain no chapters on peaceful female-led societies, no lessons on civilizations built upon harmony rather than domination, only the rise of patriarchal empires, ceaseless warfare, and male dynasties. The explanation may lie in a global power shift. When warrior nomadic tribes from the north swept across various regions, they introduced a new societal framework, a patriarchal model where the strongest governed and men dominated religious, military, and political spheres. To solidify this new worldview, the old one had to be eradicated. Goddesses were transformed into subordinate figures, Mother Earth was supplanted by Father Sky, and origin stories were rewritten. Instead of humanity being born of a goddess, it was molded from clay by an omnipotent male deity. Thus, new myths emerged, new religions ascended, history fundamentally shifted, and the feminine aspect of human memory was relegated, buried beneath symbols, metaphors, or simply dismissed as folklore. However, that which is silenced rarely truly disappears. It persists in the earth, in cave art, in symbols, and within our collective unconscious. Today, as contemporary society begins to scrutinize gender imbalances, these fragments of an ancient feminine civilization are resurfacing not to supplant patriarchal history, but to complete the mosaic of humanity. This enriched perspective encompasses not only war but also birth, not merely governance but also nurturing, not solely strength, but also profound connection, a history in which the mother once occupied the center of the universe. It is commonly asserted that history is written by the victors. Yet, few truly grasp the profound implications of this assertion. For when one side triumphs in conflict, it appropriates not merely the land, wealth, or populace, it seizes the prerogative to dictate the narrative. And that narrative, more often than not, bears scant resemblance to objective truth. Consider the global map. How many territories once belonged to entirely distinct cultures before they were conquered, assimilated, and subsequently expunged from historical accounts? The Celts, for instance, once spanned a significant portion of Europe, leaving behind megalithic temples, solar worship traditions, and ancient triple spiral symbols. However, with the expansion of the Roman Empire, they were branded as barbarians, their faith outlawed, their language suppressed, and their culture absorbed. Today, we delve into the grandeur of Rome, while the Celts are relegated to a mere historical footnote. Similarly, the indigenous peoples of North America, comprising millions of individuals across hundreds of tribes, languages, and extensive trade networks, possessed deep, nature-based belief systems for millennia. Upon the arrival of Europeans, their intricate societies were not recognized as civilizations, but rather labeled a wilderness, transforming the act of seizure into an act of discovery. Modern American history often commences not with the acknowledgement of pre-existing populations, but with the assertion of European arrival. The Aboriginal people of Australia inhabited that continent for over 60,000 years, representing the oldest known continuous culture on Earth. Yet, when the British arrived, they declared it times terra nullius, times land, belonging to no one, thereby negating the need for treaties or recognition, and effectively erasing them from collective memory. This pattern is not confined to ancient history. In the 20th century alone, entire cultures were obliterated within mere decades through warfare, propaganda, and rewritten schoolbooks. Conquerors were recast as explorers, cultural destruction as modernization, and monuments were erected to the victors, while the names of the vanquished were buried. The most poignant aspect, however, is not the silence in history books, but when an entire people begins to internalize the distorted version, when they are taught in schools that their ancestors were primitive, backward, or uncivilized, when they forsake their native languages, when they take pride in assimilating into the culture of their conquerors. At that juncture, history no longer needs to be burned, it has been supplanted from within. The beneficiaries are invariably the victors, who rewrite history in their own idiom, embed their values, and wield memory itself as a tool of control. Nevertheless, memory seldom truly perishes. It persists in legends, in folk songs, and in the unspoken grief of generations who have lost connection with their ancestral heritage. Contemporary historical narratives frequently celebrate explorers such as Christopher Columbus, Vasco da Gama, and Ferdinand Magellan as pioneers who facilitated global interaction, uncovering unknown continents and catalyzing globalization. However, a critical pause reveals a crucial oversight. Was Columbus truly the first to discover the Americas, given that millions of people already inhabited the land? Do their prior existences not merit consideration? And what of the mariners and navigators from China, the Arab world, Africa, or even Northern Europe? Where do they fit into this approved timeline? The reality is that numerous explorers preceded Columbus. They are simply omitted from the mainstream narrative because their journeys did not align with the approved historical schema. Consider Zheng He, a Muslim admiral under China's Ming dynasty in the 15th century. He commanded vast fleets across the Indian Ocean, reaching as far as East Africa. His ships dwarfed those of Columbus, and his voyages spanned thousands of nautical miles, transporting scholars, goods, and even libraries. Zheng He's mission was diplomatic, focused on connection and knowledge exchange, not conquest. Yet, after the Ming court's political orientation shifted, all records of his monumental voyages were deliberately destroyed, a significant chapter in maritime history erased from the official account. Similarly, Arab navigators meticulously mapped stars and monsoon winds, establishing trade routes to Southeast Asia and East Africa centuries before European maritime expansion. They did not plant flags or claim discovery of already inhabited lands, and consequently, their contributions are often discounted. One might also consider the Mali Empire under Mansa Abu Bakr II, where some sources describe transatlantic expeditions preceding Columbus. These remain largely unacknowledged, perhaps due to racial biases embedded within historical interpretation. The Norse Vikings, for example, reached Newfoundland, Canada, establishing settlements and trading with local populations. Yet, their saga was relegated to the realm of folklore because it did not conform to the narrative of modern Western discovery. Only with archaeological confirmation of Viking settlements in North America did historians begin to accept their account, though Columbus often remains the focal point of the broader narrative. The peril in forgetting these explorers extends beyond merely losing their names. It involves losing the alternative modes of interaction they embodied. Most did not arrive with gunpowder, did not rename existing places, nor did they inscribe their legacy on maps with bloodshed. However, in a historical framework where conquest defines heroism, those who sought to connect rather than conquer are seldom celebrated. If one is not a conqueror, one is often excluded from the textbook. Therefore, the question arises, are we now sufficiently mature to re-evaluate these journeys, not through the lens of empire, but through the perspective of those who traveled to learn, to share, and to build bridges, not to burn them? Perhaps these are precisely the explorers the modern world most critically needs to remember. When discussing colonialism, the focus often centers on occupation, resource extraction, and the imposition of governance. However, a seldom addressed aspect, potentially more destructive than all others, is the systematic rewriting of history. For centuries, Western empires arrived in Africa, Asia, and Latin America not solely to appropriate resources, impose forced labor, or proselytize. They embarked on a far more insidious mission, to enlighten the past of peoples they unilaterally labeled as savages. This commenced with the minimization and culminated in the erasure of indigenous histories. In India, the Indus Valley Civilization, despite its sophisticated urban planning, advanced drainage systems, and mathematical achievements dating back over 4,000 years, was pejoratively dismissed as primitive. In Africa, claims were made that the pyramids of Sudan, the stone cities of Great Zimbabwe, or the libraries of Timbuktu could not possibly have been constructed by black Africans, implying external intervention. In Latin America, the magnificent empires of the Inca, Maya, and Aztec were portrayed exclusively through a lens of barbarity and ritual violence, deliberately sidelining their extraordinary accomplishments in astronomy, architecture, and medicine. Colonial textbooks were not merely factually incorrect, they were intentionally distorted. This was not due to a dearth of evidence, but rather an underlying fear. If colonized peoples remembered their true heritage, they might cease to be submissive. Consequently, for over a century, children in India were taught more about British monarchs than their own ancestors. African children were instructed that Columbus discovered lands their forebears had inhabited for millennia. Native American children were forcibly enrolled in boarding schools, forbidden to speak their languages, and indoctrinated into believing their ancestors were wild and uncivilized. Even within archaeology, numerous discoveries were altered or suppressed simply because they contradicted the Eurocentric historical timeline. In the 19th and 20th centuries, European scholars described ancient Egyptians as white to circumvent, acknowledging that Africans had built one of humanity's greatest civilizations. Ancient Chinese and Arab maps were excluded from official archives. Indigenous languages were dismissed as unsophisticated and unworthy of preservation. The profound consequence was that billions of people grew up bereft of their ancestors' true history, and worse, were taught to be ashamed of it. For to dominate a populace across generations, chains are less effective than the inculcation of a belief that their ancestors achieved nothing great, that all progress originated externally, and that they should be grateful rather than inquisitive. Nevertheless, truth does not remain interred indefinitely. Today, a growing movement involves individuals scrutinizing banned records, studying archaic maps, and relearning ancestral tongues, revealing that their past was never inferior. It was simply recounted in the voice of the conqueror. If one assumes that individuals who profoundly shaped history are invariably memorialized in textbooks, a re-evaluation is warranted. History, as has been demonstrated, is not a neutral record. It is a contested terrain of remembrance where names are either preserved or effaced, not solely based on merit, but on their congruence with the narrative of those in power. Throughout millennia, countless individuals have contributed significantly to the development of entire civilizations. Yet, their names remain absent from school curricula. No monuments are erected in their honor, and no national holidays commemorate them. Their disappearance has been deliberate. Consider science, for instance. How many are familiar with Hypatia, the brilliant female philosopher, astronomer, and mathematician of Alexandria? Living in the 4th century, she taught publicly, presided over the city's most respected school of thought, and authored works on geometry, physics, and astronomy. However, because she was a woman and not a Christian, she was branded a witch, viciously assassinated by a zealous populace in the streets, and her writings were destroyed. Today, she is mentioned only faintly, often as a tragic historical footnote. Similarly, consider Ibn al-Haytham, the 10th century Arab scientist who laid fundamental groundwork for the scientific method. He conducted pioneering studies in optics, vision, and light centuries before Europe's scientific revolution. Yet, in most modern physics courses, his name is scarcely acknowledged, not due to a lack of importance, but because his contributions do not fit the prevailing Western-centric narrative. Likewise, Wang Zhenyi, an 18th century Chinese female astronomer who meticulously constructed models of solar eclipses, authored mathematical textbooks, and developed theories ahead of her time, is omitted from mainstream history for not conforming to the expectations of her feudal era. In the realm of politics, numerous reformers courageously challenged injustice and endeavored to establish more equitable societies. However, because their efforts did not serve the interests of empires, they were vilified, exiled, or simply erased. Even many renowned inventions attributed to celebrated figures may not have originated with them. Enslaved black inventors created machinery, Arab craftsmen designed architectural marvels, and women formulated life-saving medicines. Yet, their innovations were often credited to more acceptable names. And just like that, history saw a change of ownership not merely of lands, but of legacies. The core question, therefore, is not merely how many great individuals have been forgotten, but why times it was deemed necessary to forget them. Perhaps they challenged the established order. Perhaps they blurred the rigid distinctions between civilized and savage, distinctions that empires required to justify their dominance. Perhaps they were women, people of color, indigenous, or outsiders. When such names are erased, humanity loses more than a few stories. It loses the capacity to envision an alternative world, a world where scientific endeavor is not monopolized, where intelligence is not judged by ethnicity or gender, and where truth requires no official sanction to be believed. One might ponder the unsettling possibility that we are operating within an incorrect chronological framework. What if the entire historical timeline we have been taught is not merely flawed, but fundamentally inaccurate? This is not unsubstantiated conjecture. For over a century, a growing body of independent researchers, alternative archaeologists, and unconventional historians have been questioning the very chronology of human civilization. They do not dispute the existence of ancient cultures, but rather challenge times when times they existed, and in times what order asterisk. One of the most controversial propositions is the phantom time hypothesis, advanced by German historian Heribert Illig in the 1000 990 seconds. Illig posits that nearly 300 years of European history, specifically from 614 to 911 AD, may never have occurred. He argues these centuries were fabricated by powerful figures, most notably Emperor Otto III and Pope Sylvester II, to position themselves at the prestigious symbolic milestone of the first millennium. The alleged consequence is that dozens of royal dynasties, documents, and architectural records may have been falsely dated, advancing the entire human timeline by nearly 3 centuries. While audacious, Illig and other researchers present unsettling clues. A scarcity of solid archaeological evidence for many key events during the 614 to 911 AD period. Architecture and art from the so-called Dark Ages exhibiting minimal progression, as if time had indeed stood still, and ancient calendar systems repeatedly modified, leaving behind perplexing lacunae and inconsistencies that remain unresolved. Furthermore, some scholars point to ancient megalithic sites such as the Egyptian pyramids, the stone platform of Baalbek, and the fortress of Puma Punku, suggesting they may be thousands of years older than conventionally believed. Take Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, for instance. A massive, sophisticated temple complex dated to at least 11,000 years ago, predating agriculture, writing, and the recognized dawn of civilization itself. Its very existence has compelled archaeologists to fundamentally rethink the entire narrative of human social evolution. If Göbekli Tepe was real, and constructed by an advanced, organized society, then perhaps even older civilizations once thrived and were subsequently erased from human memory. Why then would our timelines be so profoundly mistaken? Was it a technical error, a mere lack of evidence, or, more disturbingly, was it intentional? For when power seeks to control memory, it not only rewrites the story, but it also reconfigures time itself. Controlling the timeline means controlling the sequence of achievements. It allows one to dictate what preceded what, framing the past in a manner that glorifies some and expunges others. This is precisely how an earlier culture can be labeled primitive, while later ones are hailed as advanced. In this manner, the very concepts of who is civilized and who is savage become entrenched. Therefore, if it were not actually the year 2025, but perhaps 1725, or if human civilization did not commence 6,000 years ago, as textbooks assert, but perhaps 30,000 years ago, would one dare to question not just history, but the very foundation of our self-understanding? For centuries, the enigmas of history were obscured by convenient excuses. Insufficient evidence, lost manuscripts, undeciphered scripts, and unverifiable claims. However, this landscape is transforming with unprecedented speed. Artificial intelligence, in conjunction with digitization technologies, is converting what was once considered irretrievably lost into something suddenly within reach. No longer do centuries of painstaking research suffice. Mere hours of data processing can now yield profound insights from charred scrolls, broken stones, and extinct languages. The outcome is not merely novel knowledge, but the re-illumination of ancient truths. Consider 2023, when researchers employed AI to decode the ancient scrolls of Herculaneum, a city buried alongside Pompeii by a volcanic eruption. For centuries, these carbonized scrolls were deemed unreadable. Yet, through deep learning algorithms, word by word, line by line, lost philosophical texts and ideas entirely absent from mainstream history began to emerge. Similarly, AI is now cross-referencing ancient maps with satellite imagery, revealing architectural patterns concealed beneath the Amazon jungle, the Sahara Desert, or the floor of the Mediterranean Sea. These structures, absent from historical records, may belong to civilizations long erased from memory. AI is also comparing ancient texts across disparate civilizations, uncovering striking similarities previously overlooked by academic circles, prompting more profound inquiries. Could a global knowledge system, a shared network of wisdom, have existed long before the internet, oceanic voyages, or even maps? In pioneering projects, AI is being trained on millions of archaeological and historical records to predict missing patterns, such as the potential locations of undiscovered cities, or the likelihood of unnamed civilizations having once flourished. Perhaps the most potent attribute of AI is its inherent lack of historical bias. It remains loyal to no ideology, nation, or religion. It simply processes data, exposing what has been missed or deliberately ignored. For many, this represents a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, a chance to revisit history, unfiltered by empire, dogma, or curriculum. Yet, some remain uneasy. If AI begins to reveal too much, will certain powers intervene to suppress the data, restrict the algorithms, or dictate the outcomes? After all, if history is a tool of power, then any tool that rewrites history poses an existential threat to that power. Indications of this resistance are already apparent. Some research projects have lost funding, incredible findings have been excluded from official publications, and controversial discoveries are summarily dismissed as conspiracy theories. Thus, the question transcends what AI can help us uncover. It becomes whether society will permit the truth to surface once it no longer serves the powerful. It is a common observation that each generation is instructed that history is a complete and settled domain. Primitive peoples inhabited caves, followed by agriculture, then empires, and all else is a closed book. However, by examining the underlying assumptions, a disquieting realization emerges. Modern education is not a mirror of truth, but rather a filter of memory, designed to preserve only that which serves the current order. For instance, why are students meticulously taught about Roman conquests, Napoleon, or the World Wars, yet remain largely ignorant of the rich civilizations of Africa, the scholars of the Arab world, or the ancient scientists of the East? Why is ancient history consistently presented along a linear timeline, with the West inevitably portrayed as the apex of human achievement? Why are narratives like Tartaria, Lemuria, or even well-documented outlier discoveries dismissed as myths, regardless of accumulating evidence? The issue is not a deficit of information. Records, artifacts, and data exist. The core problem is that the system was not constructed to foster critical inquiry. It was designed to offer comfort, to ensure a widespread belief in a singular version of the story, not because it is inherently correct, but because it is stable. When history is presented as a fixed sequence of indisputable events, it stifles curiosity and inhibits critical questioning, thereby preserving existing power structures. Modern education frequently reduces monumental revolutions to a single line in a textbook, ignores erased figures, and leaves entire civilizations unexamined, often for political expediency. Digital-era discoveries are dismissed for lacking scholarly consensus. But then, one must ask, who generates this consensus? Who authors the textbooks? Who devises the standardized tests? Who determines what is deemed too controversial to teach? One might dismiss the past as irrelevant to the present. Yet, the truth is that the way history is taught fundamentally defines humanity itself. If one is instructed that ancestors merely hunted and feared thunderstorms, one may never question the extraordinary potential within oneself. If one believes that all progress originated elsewhere, one remains perpetually a receiver, never a creator. This, indeed, is the most profound purpose of perpetuating distorted history in education. Not to compel belief in a falsehood, but to erode belief in oneself. Imagine residing within a magnificent edifice, everything appearing perfectly stable, until a whisper suggests, the foundation of this house was once an ancient sacred site, but it was leveled and buried. Would one continue to rest peacefully, or would an urge arise to examine every brick, every corner, questioning what truths might be concealed? History operates similarly. As we synthesize the disparate elements uncovered throughout this exploration, forgotten civilizations, suspicious timelines, incinerated knowledge, vanished figures, and an educational system that selectively curates memory, a singular question naturally emerges. Are we living within an edited version of history? A version where glorious eras are dismissed as myths, centuries of violence are veiled behind terms like enlightenment, discovery, or civilization, where ancient cultures are pruned and neatly arranged into a timeline far too simplistic to be credible, and where transcontinental, transgenerational connections are severed, as if humanity never shared a collective memory. It is crucial to recall that history is not merely what occurred. It is how times we choose to narrate what occurred, and that narration invariably reflects the power dynamics shaping the present. When an empire collapses, history is rewritten. When a religion ascends, the narrative is revised. When a political system takes hold, textbooks are replaced, and occasionally, an entire people's memory is overwritten with imagery they never created. The consequence is that we are raised within a curated narrative, a version deemed safe, a version deemed profitable, a version where the raw truth has been excised, blurred, or supplanted. Worse, when this version is reiterated across generations, it begins to solidify as the sole reality. We forget the missing pieces. We cease to question the inexplicable gaps. We lose the intuition that we may have been severed from our deepest roots. Yet truth, however long it remains buried, inevitably finds its way through the cracks. It may reside in a forgotten map, a ruin beneath the sands, an undeciphered script, or even in the collective unconscious dreams of a lost golden age that everyone somehow remembers without explicit instruction. As more individuals begin to question rather than merely accept, that edited version of history begins to destabilize, not through rebellion, but through the reawakening of memory. Ultimately, what constitutes history? Is it an objective chain of events, or a mirror of collective memory, obscured by the dust of time? Is it what has been recorded, or what has been time's chosen times to be recorded? We have traversed through layers of time, uncovering fragments that someone once hoped would be forgotten civilizations, incinerated manuscripts, erased names. What has been revealed are indications of a far grander narrative, deeper, more intricate, and at times fundamentally divergent from what was taught. The deeper aspects of this story, however, reside not in texts, but within the individual. History does not merely exist in textbooks. It resides in how we remember, how we retell it, and the choices we make consequently. Should one harbor an intrinsic sense that something is amiss, or question why profound inquiries are seldom posed in educational settings, or perceive that crucial pieces remain absent, then one may well be part of a generation undergoing a reawakening. This journey invites continued reflection on the narratives that define our past and present. History remembers the fall of the Knights Templar as a moment of extinction. But what if that was never the end? What if, beneath the ashes of persecution, the order did not vanish? It transformed, hidden within noble houses, beneath altered names. The last knights may have survived through blood, not battle. Tonight, we follow the whispers of their descendants, the secret families who refuse to die with history. The demise of an ancient order is often recounted as absolute, yet an enduring enigma persists. When the Knights Templar faced persecution, their eradication from historical records was not entirely successful. A select few vanished without a trace. Their disappearance was not into the oblivion of execution or incarceration, but into an orchestrated silence, adopting new identities, migrating to distant lands, and integrating into different genealogies. Through strategic matrimonial alliances, their descendants ascended to positions of influence. Their symbols, once overt, became subtly embedded within public view, their core mission remaining steadfast. For generations, murmurs have persistently linked various families, both eminent and inconspicuous, not to their overt actions, but to their inherent identity, past or present. Should these unconfirmed accounts prove accurate, the Templar legacy did not conclude. It merely underwent a titular metamorphosis. The fervent purges of the past have long subsided, yet the residual glow of their embers persists beneath forgotten heraldry, within sealed archives, and behind every whispered name. This exploration endeavors to uncover the lineages that defied historical eradication, the bloodlines that steadfastly refused to succumb. Visualize standing amidst the desolate remains of a medieval ecclesiastical structure, its roof long since succumbed to time. Moonlight streams through empty arches where vibrant stained glass once emulated fire. Below, the fractured floor conceals a crypt, its entrance not denoted by a conventional cross, but by a crimson seal intricately carved into the stone. One perceives the immense weight of centuries settling with the dust, accompanied by an almost palpable, quiet yet intentional presence, akin to a secret perpetually observed. This narrative transcends mere myth or legend. It is an account of profound survival, not the survival chronicled in academic texts or monumental inscriptions, but that preserved through tacit understanding, within cherished heirlooms, in symbols meticulously woven into bridal attire, and through names subtly transmuted over successive generations. It is a discourse on blood, not in its visceral, sensational context, but in its genetic, ancestral essence, a lineage that retains memory, bears intrinsic obligation and adeptly conceals its existence. The obliteration of the Knights Templar in the early 14th century represented far more than a mere military or religious judgment. It constituted the systematic dismantling of a vast, interconnected network, an infrastructure and brotherhood that spanned continents and, arguably more significantly, extended across multiple generations. Beyond their considerable wealth, they possessed families and established lines of succession. If, as widely theorized, the Knights of the Red Cross foresaw their imminent downfall, it is logical to assume they would have made provisions. Would they not have safeguarded their most invaluable asset, not their material riches, but their enduring legacy? This inquiry pursues that pivotal question towards a profound and disquieting conclusion that beneath Europe's ornate family crests, intertwined with particular political unions, concealed within cryptic inheritances, and underpinning seemingly disparate manifestations of power, a singular, persistent thread may exist, a bloodline the Church strenuously endeavored to extinguish, yet which steadfastly resisted quiet cessation. This exploration will uncover accounts of mysteriously vanished heirs, unconventional matrimonial alliances, meticulously fabricated identities, aristocratic residences, housing sealed libraries, and subterranean vaults within Swiss mountains concealing more than mere financial assets. We will delve into intricate heraldic codes, long-lost historical documents, DNA studies with implications that remain unpublished, and families who, despite disavowing any Templar ancestry, possess precise sword hilts, seals, and artifacts unequivocally linked to the defunct order. It is not the premise of this investigation to assert that every European noble possesses a clandestine Templar lineage. Such a claim would be patently specious. Yet, interspersed throughout historical records are subtle indications of an alternative narrative elements that defy conventional historical accounts. An anomalous pattern, an incongruous name, a seal that should not logically exist. Lineages that ostensibly disappear for a century often re-emerge, demonstrating unprecedented levels of influence. Furthermore, an inexplicable preoccupation with discretion, ancestral customs, and uncatalogued relics frequently characterizes these entities. Therefore, the pertinent inquiry is not whether the bloodline merely endured, but rather, what if it never truly ceased to exist? And critically, who continues to safeguard it? Further insights into these historical enigmas can be obtained by following our ongoing research. The atmosphere in Paris during the autumn of 1307 must have been charged with a metallic chill, sharpened by an pervasive secrecy. Just before dawn, as the majority of the city remained in slumber, beneath a bruised, pre-dawn sky, armored boots echoed with measured rhythm through alleys and across squares. Men bearing torches and sealed royal warrants approached thick wooden doors, their intent not courteous inquiry but resolute intrusion. Refusal was not an option for their targets, the Knights Templar, then Christendom's most elite military order. However, a critical discrepancy became apparent, not in the arrests themselves, which proceeded as planned, but in the notable absences. When the king's forces breached the doors of Templar commanderies, they secured ledgers and vestments, but neither the Grand Master's treasury nor the order's secret archives were found. Even Grand Master Jacques de Molay would be apprehended later, suggesting a calculated delay, perhaps just long enough to incinerate crucial parchments. Yet, numerous other senior Templars were simply gone. No bodies, no signs of resistance, merely an unexplained void. This was not an intelligence failure. Philip IV, known as Philip the Fair, had meticulously orchestrated this operation for months, possibly years, with assistance from within the church hierarchy. The timing was precise. How then could dozens, perhaps hundreds of high-ranking Templars have vanished without a trace? And how were key vaults, ostensibly secured by locks and seals, found already empty? Even more intriguing were the items not confiscated. At several locations, inquisitors documented symbols carved into stone that deviated from the standard Templar cross. Rosettes, enigmatic sigils, and intertwined serpents were noted. Some theorized alchemical significance, while others suspected these were familial or bloodline markers rather than theological emblems. In the fervor of the arrests, these iconographic anomalies were disregarded. The church sought heresy. The king desired gold. Neither seemed interested in arcane symbolism. Later, as the trials commenced, the few captured knights provided little substantive information. Some were evidently broken, others remarkably evasive. A lesser-known commander from Poitiers was recorded whispering during his interrogation. "We were told to leave the house before the house fell." This statement transcends military strategy. It borders on prophecy. The French populace, meanwhile, evinced a palpable unease. The arrests were too seamless, too abrupt. There were no pitched battles, no sieges, only sealed orders and men disappearing into the night. For an organization of warrior monks, renowned for their martial prowess and defiance, the ensuing silence was jarring. Historians frequently debate whether the Templars possessed foreknowledge of their impending doom. Some contend there was no coordinated plan, merely disparate instances of fortune. Others postulate a deeper, more sophisticated network, an early warning system extending across abbeys and ports. However, a third, less frequently entertained theory suggests that the upper echelon, the genetically linked few, had long anticipated this moment, and that escape was not merely expected, but meticulously pre-planned. One obscure yet persistent historical thread originates from letters penned by a Genoese merchant weeks after the arrests. He lamented that several regular Templar clients failed to claim their cargo, goods already paid for. Crucially, the ship manifests still indicated the crate's destinations. One location recurred multiple times: Aberdeen, a remote and frigid corner of Scotland, then under excommunication by Rome. This was a place where papal edicts could be safely disregarded, and, more importantly, a locale beyond the immediate purview of continental scrutiny. What emerges from these observations is not definitive proof of a secret exodus, but rather its resonant echo. The missing knights, the emptied vaults, the untouched symbols, the shipments rerouted to Europe's periphery, these details collectively suggest a vanishing act that was not haphazard, but meticulously executed. When one listens intently, the faint sound of a door closing behind them can almost be perceived. There is also the matter of a missing book. In Templar headquarters throughout Europe, inventories consistently listed a genealogia ordinis, a genealogy of the order. Only fragments of this document survive. However, historical whispers suggest it was not merely a list of knights, but a detailed lineage, a record of families intimately connected to the inner circle. Families entrusted not with military engagement, but with preservation. It is perhaps for this reason that the night of the arrests feels less like an ambush and more like a pre-arranged exit. The silence in the aftermath should have been absolute. Entire Templar commanderies stood hollow, their walls echoing with abandonment. The king secured his arrests, the Pope issued his accusations. Yet, as weeks extended into months, a hauntingly unresolved question lingered. Where were the heirs? The Templars possessed land, influence, and wealth, but they also held something far more enduring: kinship. Despite their vows of chastity, it was not uncommon for knights, particularly those stationed beyond Rome's direct oversight, to maintain unofficial family ties. Sons born out of wedlock, daughters discreetly placed in convents or married into lesser noble houses, and, frequently, younger brothers or cousins had already been integrated into the local aristocracy. Blood flowed in multiple directions. The records, predictably, are deliberately vague. Papal suppression ensured that any evidence of hereditary succession within the order was not only declared heretical, but systematically erased. Nevertheless, glimpses remain. In the Aragonese archives, there is a mention of an unnamed young nobleman who petitioned the crown in 1312, asserting inheritance rights to lands formerly held by my uncle, a knight of the Temple. The petition was formally denied, yet, fascinatingly, the response included a quiet grant of land in a nearby province under a different title, as if the crown was not punishing the claim but discreetly validating it. This is but one example. In the wake of the order's collapse, certain families across Europe began to experience an unusually rapid ascent. Their crests incorporated unfamiliar elements: double-barred crosses, interlaced triangles, or an occasional red bloom that was not quite a rose. They possessed no documented history of ancestral greatness. Yet, they appeared to command extraordinary respect. Doors opened, alliances formed, and in royal courts, their names were whispered with a peculiar reverence. Not fear, not awe, but obligation. One curious pattern can be traced through the Languedoc region, where several noble houses flourished after the Templars' downfall, houses that had no notable holdings prior to 1312. They constructed fortresses using Templar stone, wore rings identical to those of the order, and referred to themselves not as lords but as custodians. Some even maintained the peculiar practice of burying their dead with their feet oriented towards Jerusalem, a tradition officially abolished with the order but privately observed in family chapels. Naturally, historians endlessly debate these points. Some attribute them to coincidence, others to deliberate myth-making. However, the most peculiar details often lie in what is absent. There are entire generations in certain noble family trees where records simply vanish. No birth dates, no death dates, just blank spaces, as if intentionally erased or concealed. There is also an apocryphal story, circulated among archivists, too fanciful for publication yet too persistent to ignore, about a Templar commander who, prior to his arrest, dispatched his nephews with a singular instruction: forget our name, keep the seal. The appearance of that seal is never specified. Curiously, however, a nearly identical phrase emerges 2 centuries later in the family annals of a Baltic estate, whose coat of arms depicts a broken cross within a red square. Some scholars trace these irregularities to the Council of Vienne, where Pope Clement V formally disbanded the order. While the council's primary focus was official closure, several private petitions were also presented requests for exemptions, royal favors, and curious appeals involving unnamed wards or sponsored kin left behind by the order. These entries are vague, almost coded, but the repetition of terms such as protection, transition, and guardianship implies something more personal than mere property. It suggests blood. More tantalizing is the observation made by Guillaume de Nogaret, Philip IV's chief advisor and the legal architect of the Templar trials. In a now-lost correspondence, referenced only in the margins of another chronicler's diary, Nogaret allegedly wrote that the campaign's greatest failure was not in seizing gold, but in failing to sever the veins of influence. He did not use the word chains. He said veins, as if the true network of the Templars was held together not by loyalty, but by blood. Modern echoes of this phenomenon also exist. In interviews from the early 20th century, descendants of certain obscure, isolated, and deeply traditional French families spoke of the red line running through their ancestry. Some dismissed it as folklore, others would not elaborate. Thus, we return to that lingering question. Where were the heirs? They were never publicly crowned or announced, but perhaps they were never meant to be. Perhaps their survival depended not on reclaiming the temple, but on retreating from it, shedding the name, burying the sigil, preserving only the essence. For when an empire falls, the survivors do not always rebuild. Sometimes, they merely continue to breathe quietly in the shadow of the flame. There exists an unsettling phenomenon of recognition occurring without full comprehension. This manifests as a flicker of familiarity in a symbol carved into ancient stone or intricately engraved onto a ring inherited through generations. Such instances are not uncommon. Indeed, they are so prevalent that most individuals cease to notice them. A red cross here, a double-barred sword there, an 8-pointed star subtly concealed beneath the rim of a wine goblet at an aristocratic banquet. One might attribute these occurrences to mere coincidence, were it not for their persistent reappearance. Centuries after the Templars' dissolution, their symbols endured, not predominantly within churches or military orders, but within familial seals. Heraldry, with all its inherent pomp and pageantry, served as a sophisticated form of concealment. Certain families appeared to bear more than mere prestige within their coats of arms. They carried echoes. Echoes of banners that once commanded attention on battlefields from Acre to Antioch. Echoes of an order officially erased in name, yet undiminished in its subtle influence. One of the most recognizable examples is the double-headed eagle. While often associated with imperial power and predating the Templars, it conspicuously begins to appear in the heraldry of noble houses, with no prior ties to the Holy Roman Empire following the order's suppression. This is particularly noticeable in regions known to have provided refuge for fleeing Templars, such as the Orsini family in Italy, the Della Rovere family, and even a selection of minor German lords who suddenly adopted variations of this imperial bird. Each rendition was subtly distinct, yet invariably paired with a red element. A band, a stripe, a droplet. However, the connections transcend mere visual patterns. In the late 15th century, a Flemish nobleman commissioned a family crest featuring a pair of crossed swords behind a white tower. When questioned regarding its significance, he asserted it was an homage to the protectors of an ancient legacy. Pressed further, he added, "Our house is not built on land, but on oath." This statement was dismissed at the time as poetic embellishment. Yet, nearly 5 centuries later, that identical crest reappears, virtually unchanged, among the possessions of a retired British officer who claimed descent from those who kept the flame during the Dark Centuries. His family name was a variant of de Meaux. Then there is the curious case of the Rose and Cross. Long before its adoption as the emblem of the Rosicrucians, it was present in at least a dozen noble seals originating from France, Bohemia, and the Iberian Peninsula. Always depicted in red, it was invariably accompanied by Latin phrases that suggested less theology and more discretion. In obscuro servimus, sanguis memoratimus, nomen non proferatur. We serve in darkness, blood remembers, the name remains unspoken. The fundamental question, of course, is whether these were deliberate references or unconscious inheritances. Did these families knowingly preserve Templar codes, or were they merely repeating practices transmitted through generations, akin to a familial recipe whose origins are forgotten but whose methods are faithfully maintained without full understanding? Some scholars argue that these symbols were fashionable, borrowed from the past to confer legitimacy or an aura of mystery. This perspective holds some validity. The Renaissance indeed favored medieval throwbacks. However, the problem lies in their clustering. These symbols do not appear randomly. They concentrate in specific geographical areas, regions with documented Templar presence. They emerge within families experiencing sudden ascensions to power or influence. They manifest in locales where the Church's authority had temporarily wandered. And then there is the matter of inheritance. In heraldic law, new symbols are not adopted arbitrarily. They must be justified, earned through marriage, battle, or royal grant. Yet, several families managed to secure coats of arms with no clear origin or obvious right. Their genealogies are suspiciously vague. Their claims, when asserted, rely on conveniently vanished letters, and their wealth is consistently discreet and unexplained. One coat of arms, still displayed above the fireplace of an estate in northern Portugal, features a red chevron flanked by 2 silver stars. Local lore suggests the estate was once a Templar commandery, though no official records corroborate this. Yet, in the cellar, carved into an old wine cask door, is a symbol known to have been used by Templar naval fleets, a cross nested within a circle, bound by 4 equidistant knots. This might be dismissed as inconsequential, until one realizes that the estate's family line has never once married outside the same 5 noble houses, all of which possess similarly ambiguous roots. Naturally, one might argue that symbols are meaningless without context, that a red cross is merely a red cross, and that lineage is a narrative we construct to affirm importance. But context possesses a peculiar way of reasserting itself. In 1832, a Spanish historian unearthed a collection of family seals hidden within a church crypt near Burgos. Several bore Templar designs long présumed extinct. Alongside them was a parchment fragment which read, "Though our names have changed, the mark remains. For the name was never the power, the vow was." It is merely a fragment, perhaps a forgery. But then again, perhaps not. For sometimes, truth does not hide. It simply awaits, engraved on silver, woven into velvet, pressed into wax in plain sight, on every letter sealed not with a signature, but with an oath. If there is one document that persistently defies historical obscurity, it is the Charter of L'arminius. This parchment does not demand attention. It lacks gold leaf, a dramatic papal seal, or battle-stained parchment. Instead, it features tight, meticulously written Latin in an unbroken sequence. The document lists 33 names, 33 individuals who, according to this charter, secretly and quietly led the Templars after the order's official dissolution, as if nothing had transpired. The charter first surfaced in the 18th century, presented by the French Templar revivalist movement, immediately sparking considerable controversy. It asserts that in 1324, a Templar knight named Johannes Marcus Larmenius received the full authority of Grand Master from the imprisoned Jacques de Molay, thereby establishing a clandestine line of succession. According to the document, this lineage continued uninterrupted through centuries of silence. To maintain scholarly impartiality, mainstream historians have largely dismissed the charter as a clever forgery, likely fabricated by 18th century Templar enthusiasts to legitimize their fraternal society. There are indeed valid reasons for suspicion. Anachronistic phrasing, Latin that fluctuates between classical and modern forms, and remarkably consistent handwriting. However, the perplexing aspect is that such a document should exist at all. No group in the 1700s stood to gain any tangible benefit, no land, no inheritance, no title from claiming direct descent from an outlawed medieval order. Why, then, undertake such an elaborate deception? Even more intriguing is the charter's provenance. It was not discovered in a dusty public library or on a collector's shelf, but in the archives of the French Order of the Temple, a group that had operated discreetly for decades before ever revealing the document. Furthermore, some of the names listed on the charter, long considered fictional, have since been linked to obscure families who, remarkably, appear in royal court records as ambassadors without office or special envoys to Rome. They possessed influence, but lacked formal titles. They commanded respect, but held no public portfolios, as if operating under a different form of authority, one not publicly recognized but privately honored. One of the more peculiar footnotes in this narrative comes from a private letter written in 1804 by Bernard Raymond Fabre Palaprade, who claimed to be the current Grand Master of the surviving Templar lineage. In this correspondence, he describes visiting a French noble family who maintained, hidden beneath their chapel, a reliquary containing a sword, a seal, and a book of names written in code. The book, he stated, contained confirmations of the charter names, matching those listed in the scroll, along with obscure marginalia referencing births, deaths, and secret rituals. None of this, of course, definitively authenticates the charter, but it undeniably complicates the historical picture. For even if it was created centuries after the Templars' fall, it still draws from some memory, some oral tradition that had been preserved well beyond its presumed expiration date. Another layer of mystery arises when examining the document's style. The names of the Grand Masters are listed not by birth or family title, but by given name and region. This might seem trivial, but it aligns precisely with how original Templar records were maintained, emphasizing allegiance over aristocracy. Moreover, many of the listed names correspond not to knights from noble houses, but to confessors, priests, and advisors, often strategically placed within influential families, individuals who guided heirs behind closed doors. This reinforces the theory that the post-1312 Templar line was preserved not through battles or public decrees, but through mentorship, through quiet inheritance, through bloodlines protected by shadows and guided by men who never again wore armor, but whispered oaths into the ears of noble children. One contemporary scholar, meticulously publishing only in academic side channels, has suggested that the charter may have been written not for public consumption, but for the bloodline itself, a document of continuity passed from hand to hand like a sacred flame, a message asserting, "We are still here, and you are still bound." Skeptics correctly point out that none of this is definitive. No court would recognize the charter as legal proof. Yet, its power resides not in legal standing, but in memory, in suggestion, in the visceral chill experienced upon encountering a name etched in two places centuries apart, accompanied by the same subtly pressed sigil. Even more disquieting is what the charter omits. There is no mention of land, wealth, or political power, only names, dates, and the authority to continue. It is as if the document exists solely to confirm presence, to declare, this is who carried the oath, this is where it went. And so, regardless of whether the charter represents truth or fiction, the deeper question lingers like incense in a vaulted chamber. Why were so many individuals, across so many centuries, so desperate to claim a lineage the world was supposed to have forgotten? To comprehend Scotland's pivotal role in this narrative, one must visualize a nation caught between two excommunications. In the early 14th century, Scotland was not merely politically inconvenient to the papacy, it was effectively rebellious. The wars of independence had left it isolated from Rome, diplomatically frozen, and, as some might phrase it, delightfully overlooked qualities that rendered it an ideal sanctuary. When the Templars fell, every knight who successfully evaded capture in France required two crucial elements: a territory where Rome's authority was negligible, and a ruler who owed them a favor. Scotland in 1307 offered both. Robert the Bruce, himself excommunicated for assassinating a rival within a church, was engaged in a protracted war against the English and possessed few allies. According to several whispered accounts, Templar ships quietly docked in western Scottish harbors under the veil of darkness, met not with suspicion, but with sanctuary. And here, the narrative takes a more peculiar turn. Within a few years of the Templar suppression, Scottish battle formations began to exhibit a distinct alteration. Chroniclers of the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314 describe a sudden, disciplined cavalry charge, mounted knights in unfamiliar panoply, who emerged from the morning mist and struck the English rear with surgical precision. Traditional history attributes this to shrewd tactics, yet others suspect the timely arrival of reinforcements. No assertion is made that the Templars single-handedly secured Scotland's independence. Such a claim would be overly romanticized. However, it is noteworthy that within a generation, several knightly traditions in Scotland began incorporating symbols once exclusive to the temple. The cross-pate, characterized by blunted arms and wide tips, appeared not only in family seals but also on burial stones in Highland cemeteries. Certain clans adopted the motto "in hoc signo vinces," a phrase associated with Constantine, yet also prominently featured in later Templar ritual. Then there is the case of Ballintrodo. This small village, situated near what is now Temple, Midlothian, served as the Templars' official Scottish preceptory prior to their downfall. After 1312, the land was ostensibly slated to revert to the Hospitallers, and on paper, it did. However, records from that period are conspicuously silent. For nearly 50 years, there are no entries, no transactions, no taxation logs, just a blank expanse, followed by a sudden resurgence of activity in the late 14th century when a new family assumed control and commenced construction, though not from scratch. The foundations they utilized were already present, the tunnels already excavated. The Sinclair family, yes, they appear in this story again, emerges prominently here. In the mid-1300s, they were granted extensive tracts of land in the Lothians. By the 1400s, they were constructing Rosslyn Chapel. While the chapel postdates the Templar era by a century, its internal iconography is, to put it mildly, anachronistic. Carvings depict two knights on one horse, astronomical alignments, and scenes illustrating maize, a crop unknown in Europe at the time of construction, but common in the Americas. The edifice is either a meticulously coded message or the product of a Renaissance fever dream. However, one detail is rarely mentioned: the vaults beneath the chapel, long sealed and never excavated, rumored to contain documents, relics, or, more disturbingly, bones that do not correspond to any known Sinclair. When questioned about the continued closure of these vaults, the family has consistently offered a polite smile and stated that some things were left in trust. In the Orkneys, another pattern becomes evident. Several minor noble families, previously obscure, experienced a sudden rise in status in the early 1300s. Their family mottos referenced guardianship, silent inheritance, or, in one particularly cryptic instance, the Red Oath. They claimed no foreign lineage, yet one family's crest features a ship sailing west beneath 7 stars. Another, just a stone's throw away, uses a lion flanked by 2 kneeling monks. Coincidence, perhaps, or an enduring echo? Historians endlessly debate whether any of this points to an organized Templar refuge, or merely a scattering of exiles. Yet, even skeptical archaeologists acknowledge that Scottish castles from the 14th century onward began incorporating unusually fortified chapels, deep underground vaults, and architectural elements more closely resembling Mediterranean commanderies than traditional Celtic keeps. The most compelling hint, however, might reside in a forgotten manuscript housed at the University of Edinburgh. It is a legal contract dated 1342 between an unnamed noble and a knight of the Shadow Cross. The document is written in Latin, but the phrase "here sanguinis," heir of the blood, appears multiple times. It is unclear precisely what was being granted or to whom, but the signature includes a symbol long believed lost, the circle-bound cross of the temple, enclosed within a ring of thorns. This leads to the fundamental question: why Scotland? Because it was quiet, because it was defiant, because it was untouched by Rome at a moment when silence guaranteed safety. And perhaps most significantly, because it comprehended the value of harboring individuals whose adversaries were louder than their perceived transgressions. If the bloodline of the temple did indeed survive, it would have required time, space, and a land that prioritized oaths over paperwork. Scotland provided that. It still does. One merely needs to know where to search, and more importantly, whom to ask. Certain names resonate throughout history, not due to their overt actions, but because of what they left unexplained. The Sinclairs are one such name. to utter it within specific circles: Templar historians, Masonic researchers, casual conspiracy theorists, elicits a knowing nod. This is not because they left a clear historical trail of deeds, but because they bequeathed a profound puzzle, one sculpted in the form of a chapel adorned with enigmatic iconography, deeply rooted in a lineage that appears almost too conveniently placed at too many historical junctures. The Sinclair family, or Street Clare depending on the era and scribe, first rose to prominence in Scotland during the 11th century. However, their narrative becomes particularly intriguing after the Templars' demise. In the decades following the Order's dissolution, the Sinclairs quietly ascended, accumulating land, royal favor, and influence. They became hereditary Grand Masters of Scottish Freemasonry, a position of ceremonial importance that may, just may, conceal something far older, something inherited. Rosslyn Chapel, constructed in the 15th century by William Sinclair, stands as the nexus of their mystery. It is a breathtaking edifice, Gothic in style, yet unconventionally so. Its pillars and arches are replete with symbolism. There are angels depicted playing bagpipes, carvings of maize, a crop unknown in Europe prior to Columbus's voyages, geometric patterns that echo Kabbalistic structures, and, of course, ubiquitous Templar motifs. 2 knights on one horse, 8 pointed stars, and a solitary green man subtly nestled in the rafters, seemingly observing. Some postulate that Rosslyn was conceived not as a mere chapel, but as a reliquary, a stone enclosure designed to house something significant, perhaps documents, perhaps bones, or perhaps, as one whisper suggests, a lineage itself, encoded within the architecture, shrouded in ritual and sealed in silence. The chapel's floor plan is said to mirror that of Herod's temple in Jerusalem. According to certain Masonic sources, the apprentice pillar, a central and distinctive feature, bears spiral carvings that exhibit striking similarities to both Norse designs and Middle Eastern columns. This confluence of styles should not logically exist within a single room, unless that room was explicitly intended as a cipher. Then there is the family vault. Access is strictly forbidden to all outsiders, scholars, journalists, and even local authorities. The Sinclairs have maintained its sealed status for centuries, citing familial respect. However, local legends assert it contains more than just bones: a sword wrapped in red cloth, scrolls bearing names erased from history, and a book whose cover is fashioned not from leather, but from chainmail. It is important to emphasize that none of this has been definitively proven, and much of it remains unpublished in official historical channels. Yet, the family's own documents offer perplexing details. A 1,590 Sinclair genealogy records an ancestor known as Hugo, the Guardian, who was given charge of the flame in the north. The nature of this flame is never elucidated, nor is the curious footnote attached to his name. He was not born Sinclair, but became one in oath. That phrase, became one in oath, resurfaces in Masonic archives 2 centuries later, used to describe initiates into the Royal Arch, a Masonic degree some believe encodes Templar rituals. This overlap is too unusual to disregard. Furthermore, a small, easily overlooked detail exists within one of the carvings on Rosslyn's exterior, a shield bearing a cross pate, and beneath it, faintly, the initials JDM. Scholars have largely dismissed this as graffiti. However, some theorize it represents Jacques de Molay, the last Grand Master of the Knights Templar, a memorial etched in stone, or perhaps a signature asserting continuity. Sinclair descendants have granted few interviews. One from the 1,960 seconds concludes with a peculiar quote. When asked about his family's Templar roots, the elderly man smiled and remarked, "Roots? No. Grafts? Maybe. Sometimes trees bear fruit from branches that were never theirs to begin with." The most compelling aspect of the Sinclair mystery is not the assertion that they times were times Templars, but that they conducted themselves as individuals who time sheltered times them. Every aspect of their ascent feels inherited, an accumulation of borrowed influence, adopted symbols, and edifices so rich in secret language as to preclude mere coincidence. Even their discretion appears deliberately cultivated. If they were not the direct bloodline, perhaps they served as its guardians, or perhaps something more intimate transpired. They may have married into it, or absorbed it like ink into parchment, integrating so completely that the distinction between the knightly legacy and the noble family became indistinguishable. Ultimately, Rosslyn stands not as a definitive answer, but as a question etched in stone, a chapel no bishop ever fully claimed, a vault no historian has ever entered, and a family that insists upon its ordinariness, while quietly tending one of Europe's most extraordinary, yet unconfirmed, legacies. One can traverse its halls, run a hand along its intricate carvings, but what one perceives most profoundly is the weight of something unfinished, something that still awaits a silence shaped like a name. There is an almost theatrical quality to losing everything, only to reappear in a different guise, center stage, without missing one's cue. This succinctly describes how the theory of Templar survival often manifests in this investigation, not through overt swords or relics, but through titles that should not logically exist, titles that were not transmitted by conquest or conventional inheritance, but which appear to echo across time long after the historical stage was ostensibly cleared. The title Prince of Jerusalem is one such spectral designation. In the medieval world, it was a grandiose, sacred, and politically charged appellation. It originated during the Crusader states, referring to the rulers and high nobility of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. However, after the city's fall in 1291, and certainly following the Templars' dismantling, it should have been relegated to a mere historical footnote, a ruined title for a ruined aspiration. Yet, it inexplicably lingered. Throughout the 14th and 15th centuries, documents begin to surface across Europe, referencing obscure nobles bearing the title Princes Hierosolymitanis. In some instances, these individuals vanish from the records just as quickly as they appear. In others, they ascend to curiously discreet prominence. Ambassadors without declared countries, financiers with no traceable inheritance, or foreign lords granted privileges in courts far removed from their purported homelands. They bear enigmatic coats of arms, often featuring the Jerusalem cross, with subtle modifications, sometimes encircled by serpents, sometimes pierced by a sword, always deliberate, always defiant. One particularly striking case originates from southern Italy, where a noble family, relatively unknown prior to 1320, suddenly appears in court records with a land grant in recognition of services rendered to the Kingdom of Heaven. This is not a metaphor, it is the literal phrasing in the grant. No mention of crusades, no documented wars, merely the phrase and the symbol stamped at the bottom, a red seal bearing a five-fold cross enclosed within a double ring, an ancient Templar motif subtly reimagined. The narrative becomes even more peculiar in the case of the Demerara family, based in the Piedmont region. They held substantial power during the Crusades, but by the 14th century, their influence had ostensibly waned. Yet, a 1371 letter from the Hungarian crown refers to a Prince of Jerusalem, protector of the Old Pact. The letter was addressed to an individual named Thomas Dion Ferreira, whose name did not appear on any official family tree. His name was later erased in a royal ledger and replaced with a curious scribal note, transferred under foreign guise. What does this imply? Some theorists argue it was a code phrase, a method of documenting someone operating under an assumed identity, a legal fiction designed to protect an individual or an entity. That individual may have carried a bloodline that the church no longer recognized, but which others continued to honor discreetly. Hints of this phenomenon are evident even in the strange diplomatic relationships of the era. Certain nobles exerted influence in multiple courts, Spain, Portugal, Naples, yet possessed no clear feudal obligation to any of them. Their wealth derived from trade, their education was elite, and their loyalty appeared to transcend affectionate phrase that made little sense given the order had been defunct for decades. Then there is the case of the Della Rovere family in Rome. Ascending rapidly in the 15th century, they prominently displayed the Jerusalem cross on their private chapel's altar. Not a Latin cross, not the cross of the Holy See, but the unmistakable five-fold cross of the Crusader kingdom, unchanged, defiant, and etched into stone behind the pulpit. No one questioned it, no one dared. Some modern historians posit that these symbols were aspirational, invoking a lost chivalric age, a romantic branding for ambitious families. However, that theory struggles to account for the consistency. Why would families across Italy, France, Spain, and the Germanic states independently resurrect the same obscure title? Why employ the exact phrasing? Why conceal the symbolism in private chapels and sealed tombs, rather than flaunt it publicly? Unless, of course, it was not intended for public performance. Unless it served as a signal, a quiet recognition among a network that never truly expired, a lineage that simply moved underground. What if these so-called princes of Jerusalem were not merely feigning an identity? What if they perceived themselves as inheritors, not of the city, but of a legacy, a bloodline chosen, anointed, and cast into shadow? If so, they would have required new names, new titles, and new homes. But they would have carried with them the old obligations. And perhaps the most sacred of those was to remember their true identity, even if it could never be uttered aloud. It is tempting to dismiss all of this as mere pageantry. The medieval world indeed cherished elaborate costumes. But sometimes, a costume is merely a uniform with the name tag removed. And beneath the velvet and varnish, one is left with a singular, unsettling truth. No one preserves a forgotten title for centuries unless someone remembers why it held significance. When Habsburg is mentioned, one's thoughts typically gravitate towards portraits depicting prominent chins and emperors who, with almost militant zeal, engaged in consanguineous marriages. This perception is certainly valid. However, beneath the powdered wigs and intricate dynastic maneuvers, another narrative exists, one quieter, more peculiar, and significantly less discussed. It is a story involving clandestine bloodlines, meticulously planned marriages, and an ancestral history that does not quite conform to conventional explanations. The Habsburg dynasty did not originate as an imperial powerhouse. In the 11th century, they were merely another ambitious, noble family, clinging to fragmented territories in what is now Switzerland. Yet, by the 13th and 14th centuries, precisely when the Templars were being systematically dismantled, their fortunes experienced a dramatic shift. Lands, alliances, and thrones began to fall into their possession with an almost preternatural smoothness, akin to a divine inheritance. Historians commonly attribute this rapid ascent to astute political maneuvering and propitious timing. However, a few researchers, largely confined to footnotes and fringe journals, have noted an alternative detail. The Habsburg genealogy becomes unusually opaque during the exact decades of the Templar Order's disappearance. There are conspicuous gaps, instances of adopted heirs, and sudden marriages to lesser-known noblewomen from families whose sole apparent advantage was their geographical location, often suspiciously close to former Templar strongholds. Consider the intriguing case of Elizabeth of Gurs-Tyrol, who married into the Habsburg line in the early 14th century. Her family was not particularly influential. What they did possess, however, was land specifically, territory that had housed a Templar commandery less than 2 decades prior. The records pertaining to her dowry are vague, yet one clause survives in a secondary legal manuscript, referencing custodianship of archival matter not to be named. This is hardly a conventional wedding gift. Even more peculiar are the Habsburg burial rites in the Capuchin crypt in Vienna. While the Habsburgs are interred with meticulous detail, their hearts and entrails are separately buried in different churches across Austria. The official explanation is religious tradition. However, older texts suggest this practice was inherited, not innovated, a rite designed to preserve the holy vessels of legacy. This phrasing, found in a 15th century Habsburg missal, strikingly parallels language employed in Templar rituals, particularly concerning relic preservation. The symbolism does not end there. The Habsburg coat of arms prominently features the double-headed eagle, a common motif among royal houses. However, embedded within early versions of their personal sigils, used on letters and private seals, is a red diamond cross. Its proportions almost perfectly match the Templar cross pate, merely rotated slightly. Scholars have dismissed this as coincidence, yet several examples quietly accumulate dust in collections across Prague and Graz, as if hoping to escape notice. A deeper anomaly resides within the lineage of Frederick the Fair, one of the lesser-known Habsburg rulers. His ancestry includes a figure cryptically referred to in a Bavarian genealogical chart as Der Verwalter, the Watcher. There is no accompanying biography, no known portrait, only the title and a date, 1329, squarely within Europe's Templar vacuum. Such an omission feels almost surgical. Some argue that the Templars and Habsburgs simply occupied overlapping historical spaces. They moved in the same circles and dealt with the same monarchs, negating the need to invent a connection. However, others propose a more unsettling possibility, that the Habsburgs were not merely beneficiaries of the Templars' downfall, but active custodians of what the order left behind, not treasure, not relics, but blood. Consider the Habsburgs' marriage patterns. They did not simply build empires, they absorbed them quietly through calculated unions, frequently with women from obscure yet ostensibly pure lineages. Several of these brides can be traced, with careful scrutiny, back to regions with significant Templar activity in the late 13th century. Many had no brothers. Their fathers died mysteriously. Their inheritances were oddly uncontested. It is as if an unseen hand was meticulously arranging pieces to ensure that certain bloodlines were never truly lost, only transferred. And then there is the consistent, quiet appearance of the term Red House in Habsburg household records. Scholars assume this refers to hunting lodges or auxiliary estates. However, a few references link it to ceremonies closed-door gatherings held once per generation. Invoices from one such event in 1534 include ritual robes, a custom seal press, and food deliveries for 33 men of rank. No names are listed, only the phrase custodes sanguinis, keepers of the blood. Perhaps it is merely Gothic bookkeeping, or perhaps it is the echo of something older, something that transitioned from one power structure to another, like a candle flame passed in the dark, a fire too perilous to carry alone, a secret preserved, not in silence, but within dynasties. After all, if one were attempting to safeguard the final bloodline of a vanquished order, would it be entrusted to outlaws or to emperors? Sometimes, survival is not about concealment in the shadows. Sometimes, it involves stepping into the light with just enough disguise to render the truth comfortably inaccessible. Nowhere was this maneuver executed with greater style, subtlety, and long-term success than in Portugal. When the Templar order was disbanded across Europe in 1312, its properties were seized, its knights imprisoned or exiled, and its memory slandered. In Portugal, however, an entirely different outcome transpired. King Dinis, a ruler of keen intellect and political acumen, observed the smoldering wreckage of the order and, in essence, proposed a simple solution. Let us merely change the name. Thus, the Order of the Knights of Christ, Ordem dos Cavaleiros de Cristo, was born. Officially, it was a new order, approved by Pope John XXII in 1319. In practice, it functioned as a protective blanket draped over still glowing embers. Many former Templar knights were discreetly permitted to join. Their lands were returned, their hierarchy re-established, and their rituals only mildly adjusted. The headquarters relocated from Tomar to Castro Marim, and later back to Tomar again, a site the Templars had long utilized as a stronghold, complete with a fortified convent whose circular church bore a clear resemblance to the Temple of Solomon, or at least the Templar imagination of it. What Portugal achieved was not merely protection, it was preservation, a state-sanctioned sanctuary for a dissolved order, reborn not in secrecy but under royal patronage. Yet, it was not only knighthood that passed through this conduit, it was lineage. Over the subsequent century, the Portuguese royal family repeatedly intermarried with families connected to the new order. Some of these names had not previously appeared in courtly records before the 14th century. Others bore symbols on their crests that were distinctly Templar: the eight-pointed star, the stepped cross, the serpent encircling the Grail heraldry that softly spoke of memory and allegiance. Then came Prince Henry the Navigator. Born in 1394, Henry was not merely an explorer. For a period, he served as the Grand Master of the Order of Christ. Under his patronage, Portugal initiated its Age of Discovery, not solely as a colonial power, but as a vessel for something more profound. Encoded maps revealed unknown ports. Flags emblazoned with Templar crosses sailed into African harbors. And, perhaps most mysteriously, ships carried not only goods and armaments, but also scholars, priests, and carefully selected companions, men whose names appear nowhere else, individuals who vanished as readily as they arrived. Some historians contend that the Order of Christ was merely a vehicle for empire, a spiritual justification for conquest. However, documents from the era suggest a deeper purpose. Several private correspondences between Henry and his agents discuss preserving the flame, tracing the current, and reuniting the scattered terms, not typical of naval bureaucracy, but rather evocative of memory or blood. One account, never officially translated, mentions a chapel on the island of Madeira where the blood and the name are remembered. Madeira was one of Portugal's first overseas holdings. Curiously, the earliest settlers included families with no prior ties to exploration. Their genealogies, when traceable, hint at roots in Castile, France, and even Languedoc, all regions with deep Templar connections. The chapel itself, now mostly in ruins, once featured a circular nave and an inscription that read, Per manum regis, cor fratris, by the king's hand, but by the brother's heart, a dedication, perhaps, to a monarch who acted as guardian, but not progenitor. This raises an uncomfortable question. Did the Portuguese crown merely protect former Templars, or did it shelter their descendants? Several noble Portuguese families, still extant today, trace their ancestry back to figures who arrived during this period with no clear parentage but immediate royal favor. Some were granted land, others titles. A few were entrusted with sensitive roles within the Order of Christ, record-keeping, cipher translation, spiritual instruction. Their descendants, interestingly, often pursued religious or diplomatic vocations, quiet professions where secrets are less a risk and more a form of currency. And there is one final detail that resists being overlooked. In the Convento de Cristo in Tomar, headquarters of the Order of Christ, there exists a room sealed for centuries until its accidental rediscovery in 1892. Inside were remnants of ritual garments, scroll fragments in coded Latin, and a peculiar mural, a tree rooted in a red cross, branching into dozens of names, some faded, others meticulously scratched out. The fresco bore no title, but scribbled in one corner, in a different hand, were the words, O portadores continuum, the bearers continue. Portugal did not merely save the Templars, it kept them in motion. And if bloodlines were the cargo, the throne served as the vessel. It often commences, as many narratives in this account do, with a symbol, a rose blossoming from the center of a cross. Elegant, symmetrical, and seemingly innocuous, unless one possesses the specific knowledge to interpret its meaning. The Rosicrucians emerged in the early 17th century, or rather, they announced their presence then through a pair of cryptic manifestos, the Fama Fraternitatis and the Confessio Fraternitatis. They asserted themselves as the stewards of ancient wisdom, protectors of a sacred tradition, extending back not decades, but centuries. They were physicians, philosophers, alchemists, and, crucially, they insisted they were not a secret society, but rather a society with secrets. The manifestos describe a legendary figure named Christian Rosenkreutz, an individual purported to have traversed the known world in the 15th century, accumulating knowledge from Arabia, Egypt, and beyond. Upon his return, he allegedly formed a brotherhood committed to the pursuit of truth and the reformation of humanity. This narrative sounds noble, even grand, yet it falters under close scrutiny. The dates do not align, the travel itinerary is implausible, and the sudden appearance of a fully formed esoteric tradition, complete with ritual symbolism and an initiatory structure, suggests less a spontaneous movement and more, demonstrably, a strategic rebranding. This brings us to the Knights Templar. The parallels are striking. Both groups highly value discretion, ritual, and hierarchical knowledge. Both claim spiritual authority rooted in ancient traditions. Both utilize the cross as a core symbol, though the Rosicrucians appended the rose, possibly as a botanical metaphor for rebirth or a veiled reference to bloodlines. And both, significantly, appear preoccupied with sacred architecture, coded manuscripts, and the concept of preserving something the world was not yet prepared to receive. Some scholars believe the Rosicrucians were simply an intellectual response to the upheavals of the Reformation. However, others propose they represented something more profound, a vessel, a conduit for older knowledge, a continuation of a tradition whose public manifestation had been destroyed in 1312, but whose essence had endured underground. If one follows this thread far enough, the implication becomes clear. The Rosicrucians did not initiate a new movement, they inherited one. There exists an obscure French text, printed in 1681, asserting that several of the original Rosicrucian founders bore surnames matching those of known Templar families from Languedoc. While dismissed by most academics as romantic conjecture, it contains a peculiar phrase, translated roughly as the blood was entrusted not to the sword, but to the ink. This suggests that perhaps the true legacy resided not in relics or gold, but in knowledge, in coded texts, in lineages of scribes rather than knights. This is not merely literary flourish. An 18th century Rosicrucian cipher was discovered to match encryption techniques utilized in Templar banking documents, an unusual coincidence, given that the cipher was supposedly devised by Francis Bacon, an individual curiously linked to both Rosicrucianism and clandestine orders within the English court, and who, by his own admission, believed truth is the daughter of time, not of authority. Even more intriguing are the bloodlines. Several prominent Rosicrucian figures in the 17th century appear to descend from obscure noble families in Bohemia, Austria, and Iberia regions with deep medieval Templar roots. These individuals, scholars, alchemists, printers, seem to have shared more than mere intellectual curiosity. They possessed a quiet confidence, a language of subtle gestures, a preference for anonymity, and in some cases, family sigils that included, unequivocally, the Red Cross. There is also the narrative of the sleeping freighter, a figure from the Fama Fraternitatis said to be interred in a secret vault, surrounded by symbolic artifacts and uncorrupted by time. While clearly allegorical, this story mirrors older Templar legends, particularly those describing knights sealed in catacombs with relics and scrolls, awaiting discovery at the opportune moment. And then there is the omission. Nowhere in the Rosicrucian manifestos is the Templar order explicitly mentioned, not once. This is remarkable, given the overwhelming symbolic overlap. It is the kind of absence that feels deliberate, as if invoking the name would reveal too much, as if they were not writing about a different order, but themselves. One might question the rationale for continuing under a new name. Why not directly revive the Templars? The answer, perhaps, lies in perception. The Templar brand had been utterly decimated, quite literally associated with heresy, idolatry, and scandal. However, a new name, a flower replacing a fortress, allowed the mission to endure. The rose softened the cross, the philosophy masked the guardianship, and the true secret, if one existed, could persist beneath layers of metaphor. So, were the Rosicrucians merely eccentric scholars with abundant time and parchment? Possibly. But if one observes closely, if one listens intently, an older voice might be perceived speaking through the manifestos, a voice that did not originate in the 17th century, but survived into it, carried not by armored knights, but by thinkers with long memories, soft voices, and bloodlines that recalled where the fire had once burned. For sometimes the most effective way to protect a secret is to transform it into a mystery. Of all the threads that intertwine within the legend of hidden bloodlines, the Merovingians may be the most captivating. Regal, barbarous, and adorned with a kind of mystery rarely found in textbooks, they governed parts of what is now France and Germany from the 5th to the 8th centuries. Their reign concluded in obscurity, their dynasty displaced. Yet, their name persists, whispered, resurrected, and repeatedly woven into theories of secret kingship, sacred lineage, and increasingly into the shadows cast by the Knights Templar. To comprehend this connection, we must trace not merely a line of power, but a line of belief. The Merovingians asserted a divine ancestry, claiming descent not merely from nobility, but from something entirely distinct. Mythos suggested some were of Trojan descent. Others invoked a sea creature, the Quinotaur, whose union with a Frankish queen purportedly produced Merovec, the dynasty's founder. One does not integrate such profound mythology into one's family history unless something is being protected or concealed. Fast forward to the Crusades. The Templars arrived in the Holy Land, but their interest was not exclusively military. They dedicated an inordinate amount of time to excavation beneath the Temple Mount. Legends abound regarding their discoveries: scrolls, artifacts, maps, and crucially, genealogical records. Here is where the thread tightens. A recurring idea in fringe historiography, and, curiously, within the archives of certain French monasteries, posits that the Templars unearthed evidence of a sacred bloodline, not merely royal, but spiritual, not solely from David or Solomon, but from Christ himself. And this bloodline, some claim, was transmitted through Mary Magdalene to the Merovingians. Mainstream historians will predictably dismiss this, and rightly so, as the documentary evidence is tenuous, often speculative. However, what truly matters is not the veracity of the claim, but whether the Templars themselves believed it to be true. And there is growing indication that some among them did. Certain Templar rituals, documented in suppressed texts from the 14th century, reference the Bride of the Lamb and the Line of Light phrases not found in traditional church liturgy. Symbols resembling vines or serpents, intertwined with crosses, began to appear in commandery carvings, particularly in southern France, near Rennes-le-Château. And following the order's downfall, several noble families in that region adopted enigmatic mottos referencing the red inheritance or our first father anointed, not crowned. Could these be poetic? Absolutely. But could they also be veiled allusions to a spiritual political legacy passed down from an erased line of kings? This is the core of the Merovingian resurrection theory, that the Templars did not merely stumble upon forgotten tombs or hidden gold. They discovered evidence of a sacred genealogy. In doing so, they may have come to view themselves not merely as monks or warriors, but as stewards of a bloodline destined for a future return. What renders this theory even more compelling is the shift in Templar architecture during the 12th and 13th centuries. Churches once modeled on Romanesque plans began to incorporate early Gothic elements. Heightened light, verticality, rose windows. Some believe this was an aesthetic evolution. Others propose it was symbolic, a return to a divine feminine principle long suppressed by Roman Orthodoxy, an honoring of the Magdalene as co-equal to Christ, not just spiritually but biologically, as matriarch of a lineage. There is also the curious fact that following the Templars' fall, a surge of legends concerning hidden kings emerged across Europe. The Fisher King of Arthurian lore, the king asleep beneath the mountain, the wounded healer who must return variations, perhaps, of the same profound longing, that the rightful bloodline, wrongfully interred, would re-emerge when the world most required it. Is it all allegory? Quite possibly. But then again, perhaps not. The 18th century French mystic Antoine Court de Gebelin asserted that a surviving line of priest kings still existed in Europe, concealed among the nobility, patiently awaiting. In private correspondence, he alluded to those who wear no crown yet rule through remembrance. He did not name them, but he signed one of those letters with a sigil, a red rose pierced by a silver sword. That exact symbol reappears on a Masonic tracing board from 1794. Its caption reads, Custodes Sanguinis Regis, Guardians of the Royal Blood. There is no direct mention of the Merovingians. But then again, perhaps there is no need for one. For if the bloodline survived, if it was preserved, it would do so not through proclamation, but through quiet intermarriage, protected names, and ancient oaths, through orders that change their robes, alter their names, but never their fundamental mission. And perhaps that is what the Templars truly discovered beneath the Temple Mount. Not treasure, not weaponry, but a name, a line, a legacy one they could not publicly reveal, but would never abandon. The enduring nature of bloodlines hinges not on martial conquest, but on matrimonial alliances. These are not the romantic unions of poetry and scattered petals, but rather meticulously crafted arrangements involving contracts, land grants, and discreet chapel ceremonies attended by precisely 14 individuals, all of whom in some manner already share a network of secrets. Following the dissolution of the Templar Order, the official narrative posits widespread dispersion. Some knights were executed, others vanished into exile. However, what if dispersion was not the end, but a premeditated strategy? What if the true objective was not to regroup under a banner, but to strategically permeate Europe's established veins of power? This theory gains considerable traction upon examining marriage records from the early 14th century onward. A distinct pattern emerges. Obscure noble houses suddenly intermarry with widows, daughters, or cousins of defunct military religious orders. These are not high-profile unions. They are often quiet, sometimes even undocumented. Crucially, these newly merged families almost invariably experience an ascent within a single generation. They acquire lands previously held by the temple. They obtain royal favor without clear justification. And their sons, when recorded at all, enter positions of clerical authority, military logistics, or, more intriguingly, serve as private tutors to royal heirs, a highly strategic placement if one is engaged in a long-term plan. Nowhere is this pattern more evident than in Aragon, where several minor noble families, barely a footnote in medieval history, suddenly received knighthoods and small castles in the 1332. Local folklore recounts the Red Brides, women from outside the region who married into the local gentry, bringing with them locked chests, foreign sigils, and an oath of silence. This sounds theatrical until one realizes their coats of arms begin to feature increasingly elaborate crosses, some bearing an uncanny resemblance to Templar insignias, yet altered just enough to evade censure. Portugal, too, continues its role. While the Order of Christ served as a sanctuary for former Templars, it is rarely acknowledged how many of its senior members married into families connected to the Sinclairs, the de Marais, or the lesser branches of the Capets, all lineages with, shall we say, unresolved genealogical records. These were not merely social stratagems. They were bloodline braids, threads intricately twisted together to reinforce the larger strand. There was strength in unity, yes, but also secrecy and complexity. That complexity becomes evident when examining the heraldry. Intermarried families begin to display quartered arms shields divided into 4 sections, each bearing a symbol that would appear unrelated unless one understood the underlying narrative. A lion for Languedoc, a cross for Tomar, a serpent for the East. They were not overtly boasting, they were encoding. There is a curious note in a 15th century Venetian family Bible, written in the margin beside a list of children's names: "Blood divided shall not perish." This is not a proverb. It does not appear in any known liturgical texts. It sounds more like a motto, a quiet doctrine whispered across generations. Divide the lineage, interweave it, and render it impossible to extinguish. This leads us to the concept of the living reliquary, a term found in only one known document, an internal letter from a German abbey dated 1439, referring to the young lord of Altenburg, a living reliquary of the temple's last charge. This could be poetic language, or it could mean precisely what it implies, that bloodlines were being treated not as legacy, but as vessels, preserved not in stone sarcophagi, but in children, in names that would subtly shift every century just enough to remain hidden, yet never enough to sever the chain. This raises another unsettling detail: the critical role of women. Templar history often overlooks female contributions. However, in the aftermath of the Order's collapse, women became indispensable. They inherited land, they transferred names, they carried the blood. In some noble households, daughters were cloistered not for piety, but for preservation. Their marriages were arranged not for political gain, but for alignment. There is even evidence in a Burgundian estate inventory from 1387 that lists, alongside livestock and jewelry, the daughter set aside for sacred contract, not a name, not a dowry, but a designation, like a relic behind glass. And then there are the family portraits. In castles from southern France to rural Austria, one finds them stiffly painted children posed beside adults wearing robes that are not quite clerical, not quite noble, yet always present. Sometimes a hand rests on the child's shoulder. Sometimes the child clutches a book, and in more than one instance, the spine of that book features a faint cross within a square. Not ostentatious, simply present. Were these merely stylistic flourishes, symbolic nods, or were they quiet affirmations, frozen in oil and canvas, that the line continued? That the grand design to scatter, interlace, and survive had indeed succeeded? In the final analysis, the bloodline did not require a fortress. It required a family tree, one that extended, tangled, and blossomed, not through banners or public ceremonies, but in cradles. And so it did. For an institution that publicly condemned the Order of the Temple to the stake, the Vatican has devoted a surprisingly obsessive amount of time to tracking its shadow. Official records state that the Church denounced the Templars as heretics, corrupt, idolatrous, and perverse. Yet, behind this public facade, in vaults deeper than doctrine, there exists a paper trail suggesting the Church never truly believed it had severed the root, merely pruned its branches. Immediately following the papal suppression of the order in 1312, internal Vatican documents, those not intended for public scrutiny, reveal a flurry of administrative confusion. Papal accountants struggled to locate inventories. Envoys were dispatched to remote monasteries to verify transitions of custody. These efforts were not solely aimed at seizing land. They were attempts to trace individuals, specific individuals. In one memorandum filed under matters of legacy, a cardinal notes that certain names appear again within different banners, a phrase that, while cryptic, eerily aligns with the pattern of intermarriage previously observed. Another document, marked Privatum et Urgente, requests a quiet audit of baptismal registries in southern France, particularly among families who had once made significant donations to the temple. Why baptismal records? Unless, of course, someone was attempting to locate bloodlines. The Vatican's peculiar attention to this question persisted throughout the 14th and 15th centuries. In a letter from Antipope Benedict XIII, there is reference to a prince of the Eastern blood whose spiritual training must be monitored lest the flame of heresy find a new wick. The identity of this prince is never clarified, but the language implies something more than theology, something born. Centuries later, Pope Pius II evinced a private interest in certain noble families of Tuscany and Lombardy. His correspondence with a papal legate includes veiled references to descendants by doctrine and sacred continuity of questionable origin. These were not inquisitions, they were investigations. The objective was not punishment, it was containment. And perhaps most revealing of all is the Vatican's consistent refusal, across every generation, to fully unseal the records of the Templar trials. While portions have been published, scholars continue to note the existence of special registers marked Reservatum Pontificium, accessible only by papal order. Requests to review these volumes are politely, yet repeatedly, denied. Why protect the archives of a discredited order? Because the Church, more than any other institution, comprehends that blood possesses a peculiar capacity for carrying both memory and danger. Some researchers believe the Vatican was not merely concerned about Templar heresy, but about succession, that someone might emerge generations later with both the lineage and the will to challenge the Church's monopoly on divine authority, not merely through ideology, but through ancestry. The fear was not simply of a rival order, it was of a rival claim. One fringe historian, since quietly removed from his post, once stated in a conference that a classified dossier existed in the Vatican archives titled Sanguinis Custodes, Linea Templi, Guardians of the Bloodline of the Temple. He was widely ridiculed, yet within weeks of his statement, he resigned, citing health concerns. He has not granted a public interview since. There are other anomalies. In the 17th century, a Portuguese archbishop submitted a report on the spiritual practices of rural noble families who steadfastly refused to convert their private chapels to Roman standards. These chapels bore no crucifixes, only geometric designs, sunbursts, and red crosses. The archbishop described them as familial cults to an unnamed martyr. He was reassigned 2 months later. A Vatican envoy dispatched to Bohemia in 1764 encountered a convent that hosted an annual feast of the Silent Lamb. The nuns wore red ribbons across their foreheads and read from a gospel not included in any Catholic canon. When asked about its source, the abbess replied, "It has always been with us, since before my mother." Since before her mother's mother, the envoy's full report has never been published. Perhaps most damning is a brief note scribbled in the margin of a 19th century Vatican inventory log. Relic moved to Castel Gandolfo under pretense of Marian icon. Ensure no mention of Molay. Why invoke the last Templar Grand Master in a footnote about relics? Unless what was being moved was not merely symbolic, unless it was genetic. For herein lies the Vatican's central fear, that somewhere, scattered across Europe, exist names, bloodlines, or heirlooms possessing the power to reignite something it labored for centuries to extinguish. That a forgotten family might surface with sufficient historical grounding, enough documented evidence, or even enough believers, to resurrect not just the order, but the authority behind it. Not through rebellion, but through inheritance. Because doctrine can be debated, but lineage is difficult to refute, especially if it is inscribed in bones, sealed in ancient vaults, and whispered in prayers the Church never approved. And so the obsession persists, not because the Vatican remains unaware of the bloodline's path, but because, deep down, it suspects the bloodline never truly departed. If one sought to safeguard a bloodline across centuries without uttering its name, how would such a feat be accomplished? Written records are too vulnerable to destruction. Oral histories are prone to fading. Artifacts can be stolen or forged. However, coats of arms heraldry are public, permanent, and transmitted from generation to generation, serving as a signature etched in stone. And for those conversant in its language, Europe's castles and crypts are replete with these quiet whispers, the silent idiom of lineage, inscribed in color and symbol. Heraldry in theory defines identity, family, allegiance, and property. Yet, to the discerning eye, it transforms into something entirely different, a cipher, a system employed to track the movements, mergers, and metamorphoses of a vanished order that may never have truly ceased to exist. Begin with the Red Cross, the Cross Pate, the Cross Potent, the Jerusalem cross variations of a symbol that once adorned Templar shields and seals. Following the order's dissolution, these emblems should have faded into obscurity. Instead, They mutated, persisted, and reappeared in locations that no longer had any ostensible reason to display them, and frequently among families or groups with no official Templar affiliations, at least on paper. In several rural parishes in northern Italy, church documents record a peculiar phenomenon. During the 15th century, wealthy patrons, whose names were never identified, donated stained glass windows depicting knights bearing red crosses, not accompanied by saints, but by trees, stars, and architectural ruins. One particular window bears an inscription that reads simply, "Il voto rimane," the vow remains. In the French countryside, one encounters headstones carved long after the Templar era, their surfaces marked only by a red cross and a date, no name, no epitaph, nothing else. Locals sometimes refer to them as les pierres muettes, the silent stones. Attempts to identify the families associated with these graves lead to dead ends, missing registries, burned parish records, scribes without successors. Portugal is no stranger to this phenomenon. As previously discussed, the Order of Christ absorbed much of the Templar tradition. However, what is less acknowledged is the frequency with which Red Cross imagery appears in noble homes, not as a Christian symbol, but as a family crest, in dining halls, over fireplaces, carved into the backs of ornate chairs. Always the same shape, always unaccompanied by explanation. One family in Braga, when queried about the cross stitched into their ancestral standard, merely shrugged and offered, "It's always been there." Their genealogical records, however, suggest a mysterious benefactor. In the 1322, a knight who arrived without a surname, married into the family, and bequeathed a sealed codex in the chapel. It has never been opened. The seal bears a red cross enclosed in a circle, surrounded by thorns. A distinct pattern emerges here. When the red cross reappears, it does so in places where secrecy is inherently woven into the very fabric of the structures. Noble estates with closed archives, rural chapels with no listed clergy, private schools with old money patrons and no founding charter. The symbol transcends a mere mark of memory, becoming a badge of silent allegiance, not a signal for the world, but for the bloodline itself. One particularly unsettling example originates from a crypt beneath a crumbling manor in southern France. During renovations in 1973, workers discovered a small chamber lined with plaster fresco. The centerpiece depicted a knight kneeling before a woman in red robes, her hands outstretched over his head. A red cross glowed on his chest. In the lower corner of the painting was a phrase in medieval Latin, "Sanguis non perit," blood does not perish. The current owners of the estate refused to permit further exploration. Another dimension of this mystery manifests in personal artifacts, signet rings, pendants, wax seals passed down through generations. A collector in Zurich reported acquiring a 17th century signet ring bearing a red cross overlaid with a 7-pointed star. The family selling it could offer no provenance, only that it had always been kept locked away. The underside of the band, when meticulously cleaned, revealed 3 initials, JDM, the initials of Jacques de Molay. Is this definitive evidence? Not unequivocally, but neither is it random. Some theorists propose that the Red Cross functioned as a silent passport, a symbol of belonging for those within the hidden network, a means to acknowledge a shared legacy without uttering forbidden names. It was not a signal intended for the world, but for the blood. It is often the subtle details that reveal the truth. A family crest slightly modified from official records, a banner displayed at funerals, yet never at weddings, a red thread meticulously woven into ceremonial robes. Even the color itself, always that particular crimson. Not the bright scarlet of papal heraldry, nor the deep burgundy of the empire, but that soft, iron-rich red that seemed to intrinsically understand its purpose, even when no one spoke its name. Modern skeptics dismiss these occurrences as coincidence, a stylistic echo, or medieval branding. Yet, branding typically fades. This has not. It endures not because it was merely adopted, but because it was preserved not by institutions, but by families, quietly, stubbornly, sometimes unknowingly, and always at the periphery of overt visibility. For the Red Cross was never solely a symbol of faith. It was a warning, a vow, a memory, and it continues to whisper from stones, from glass, and from stitched velvet. We were here. We are still watching. Sometimes, the most revealing aspect of a family's history is the page that has been deliberately removed. Across Europe, nestled between the opulent residences of royalty, and the dusty records of lesser nobility, dozens of names flicker into the historical record and then vanish. No discernible heirs, no documented downfall, no war to account for their disappearance. Merely a lineage that abruptly ceases mid-sentence, a title quietly relinquished, a crest absorbed into another without a trace. They are known as the disappearing counts, the phantom dukes. And when their disparate narratives are interwoven, the silhouette of something entirely different emerges, not failure, but calculated strategy. Consider, for example, the Counts of Vaudemont in eastern France. They rose swiftly in the late 14th century, granted lands that once constituted Templar holdings, and maintained them with quiet efficiency. Their archives were meticulous, documenting births, marriages, expenses, and correspondence with Rome. Then, in 1483, an abrupt cessation. The name no longer appears in court registers. Their seal vanishes from correspondence. The final recorded count is listed as relocated for reasons of state. No elaboration, no burial, only silence. Similarly, the Dukes of Altenstein in the Germanic lands, known for their patronage of Cistercian monasteries, and a peculiar insistence on maintaining private chapels with layouts mirroring Solomon's temple, possessed no shortage of heirs. Yet, after 1511, no further ducal records appear. Their lands pass to a cousin whose lineage, curiously, cannot be substantiated. A footnote in an imperial ledger refers to Altenstein's dissolution as voluntary absorption, an unusual phrase for a family with over 2 centuries of territorial pride. However, suspicion deepens when considering a shared characteristic. Several of these vanishing houses bequeathed libraries, private collections stored in fortified keeps or concealed behind monastery walls. When these libraries were eventually accessed, often centuries later, researchers discovered peculiar commonalities, treatises on sacred geometry, manuscripts in deciphered Latin, and, in many cases, genealogical charts that did not align with official records. One volume from the estate of a phantom Spanish marquis includes a redacted family tree with the notation sanguis est, subtectum, the blood must be preserved beneath the roof. In Portugal, a lesser-known noble family identified only as the House of Lazaro briefly flourished in the mid-14th century before ostensibly disappearing during the Black Death. Yet, in the early 17th century, documents from a Jesuit college reference descendants of Lazaro financing esoteric theological research. Their coats of arms, maintained in a sealed vault, feature a diagonal red cross and a serpent devouring its own tail. Neither symbol matches public records. The college declined to release further information. One might presume these disappearances were bureaucratic oversights caused by war, pestilence, or absorption into larger dynasties. However, that explanation falters when one observes how frequently these vanished houses resurface under new names in new regions, often through suspiciously well-placed marriages. A lost family in Navarre reappears in northern Italy a century later, with a subtly altered name and a dowry consisting of books, not gold. A duchy in Flanders disappears just as a minor English peerage gains influence overnight, married, it seems, to a woman whose birth certificate has been misplaced for over 400 years. Even the terminology surrounding these disappearances feels coded: voluntary dissolution, title transfer under silence, deactivation of heraldry. These are not the language of defeat. They sound more akin to disbanding a unit, retiring a designation, or discreetly receding beneath the surface. There is also the matter of crest absorption. In several instances, surviving noble houses incorporate elements of phantom arms into their own, despite possessing no official genealogical relationship. A falcon's talon, a broken tower, a red star on a black field always absorbed discreetly, without royal approval, and often only in private versions of the family sigil. When questioned, descendants claim tradition. Yet no tradition maintains such consistency unless it is being actively upheld. And then there is the most peculiar detail of all: the recurrence of the number 33, not in ages or dates, but in the number of members recorded in private house charters before the lineage disappears. 33 names, 33 witnesses, 33 signatures, sometimes paired with the phrase terminus ad lucem, end at the light. Masonic symbolism, Templar residue, or merely an obsessive coincidence? The answer remains elusive. What is evident is that vanishing noble houses create space where a bloodline can move, breathe, and evolve. If one needed to preserve something sacred, something forbidden yet hereditary, how better to conceal it than within families that no longer officially exist? Families who no longer bear the name but carry the legacy, who no longer speak the words but still embody the vow. It is not extinction, it is camouflage. And when the opportune moment arises, the ancient symbols re-emerge, not as declarations, but as inheritances. A crest on a funeral shroud, a seal on a forgotten scroll, a name in the margin of a Vatican ledger, long scratched out yet still faintly legible. For sometimes the bloodline does not desire discovery. Sometimes it merely wishes to be left undisturbed until it does not. Some debts are settled with currency, others with territory. However, the most ancient, the most sacred of obligations are repaid with silence. For centuries, France has maintained a peculiar silence, one that reverberates between its cathedrals and chateaux, etched not in treaties or charters, but in blood. France served as the crucible, the birthplace and execution ground of the Knights Templar. It was here, on that infamous Friday, the 13th of October, 1307, that King Philip IV moved with terrifying precision, dismantling the order with papal sanction and royal might. Yet, despite his meticulous planning, despite the confessions extracted through torture and fire, something eluded his grasp, something endured: the bloodline. It begins with a rumor, a footnote in a 14th century judicial record mentioning lesser families of the broken oath. These were not Templars themselves, but their confidants, financiers, and distant cousins by marriage minor nobles whose names were scarcely known beyond their provincial borders. Yet, shortly after the purge, many of them received extraordinary royal pardons, not for crimes committed, but for an unstated loyalty. Consider the Montaigut offshoot of the de Foix family. Their estate survived both the Albigensian Crusade and the Templar suppression, untouched. Despite suspected Cathar sympathies and known Templar associations, they were granted increased autonomy by Charles V, along with a peculiar privilege: the right to withhold family records from both the crown and the church. One document refers to this concession as a blood privacy clause. Then there is the Montmorency-Laval line, an ancient name rich in crusading history. Their coat of arms at one point featured a stylized red cross over a silver field. This is not unusual, unless one considers the family's alleged descent from a cousin of Hugues de Payens, the first Grand Master. Intriguingly, after the Templar trials, their crest subtly changed. The red cross was repositioned to the interior of the shield and partially obscured, almost akin to a warning or a promise. The Bourbon family, long before its ascension to the throne, also appears linked through shadowed marriages to houses once affiliated with the temple. In a letter from 1436, the Duke of Bourbonnais writes of a covenant of red stone, an inheritance received through the female line which could not be spoken of under pain of eternal censure. The accompanying codicil lists the names of 3 families, none of which appear in any public record. All of them, however, bear striking resemblances to surnames found on property records of confiscated Templar estates. However, it is not merely names, it is the land itself. Certain tracts of land across France, particularly in Languedoc, Brittany, and Burgundy, were quietly transferred from the crown to obscure lords in the decades following the Templar suppression. These were not strategic holdings or fertile fields, but rather ruined strongholds and barren outposts once under Templar control. Why transfer them unless they possessed a value invisible to most eyes: caches of documents, entrusted relics, hidden passageways beneath? In the commune of Auzat, a medieval register details a land grant to the Duplessis family with one peculiar condition: no construction above a certain depth, and all alterations must be reported to a silent partner. That precise phrase appears in no other known French feudal charter. Yet, it resurfaces centuries later in a contract related to the Counts of Rochefort, another family with documented ties to suppressed monastic orders. All of this might seem like an overwhelming accumulation of coincidences. However, when the marriage patterns are meticulously traced, something more intricate appears. Over 5 centuries, a web of intermarriages links over a dozen obscure French families to each other in a circular pattern, cousins marrying cousins, alliances never quite severing the chain. The genetic spiral tightens, much like a vine wrapping around a hidden core, with the ultimate objective of preservation. And throughout this complex tapestry, recurring references to a singular concept emerge: le sang, the blood debt, not an oath, but an intrinsic obligation to protect, to remember, to await. One letter from 1702, discovered in the Jesuit archives in Lyon, speaks of a rendezvous of names lost to history but loyal to a cause that once lit the temple lamps. The author claims to descend from a bloodline buried by papal fear and royal guilt. His tone is weary but proud. He concludes with the Latin phrase fidelisque ad sanguinem, faithful unto the blood. The notion that French nobility carried such obligations is not unique. However, the specificity, the pervasive secrecy, and the enduring silence surrounding certain families is unnerving. These were not overt conspiracies. These were quiet arrangements, subtle acknowledgments across the centuries, wills inscribed in invisible ink, and lands exchanged with glances rather than signatures. Woven into this intricate design is the legacy of what was lost and what was meticulously preserved. The Templar bloodline may no longer don white mantles, but it may still walk among the heirs of France, bearing names few would recognize, yet bound by debts no currency could ever repay. For some, legacies are not constructed upon titles or thrones. They are built upon blood and the silence that ensures its endurance. One would scarcely imagine a small, soot-darkened statue of the Virgin Mary, capable of safeguarding a centuries-old secret. Yet, in certain obscure corners of Europe, where candlelight flickers against ancient stone walls and pilgrims kneel with whispered prayers, the Black Madonna transcends a mere symbol of faith. She stands as a guardian, a password, and perhaps a vital marker for bloodlines that steadfastly refuse to perish. Over 400 Black Madonnas are dispersed across the continent, from the revered shrines of Rocamadour in France to the volcanic hills of Montserrat in Spain, and extending deep into the alpine monasteries of Switzerland and Poland. Their defining characteristic remains consistent: skin as dark as ebony, features sometimes exhibiting Eastern or African traits, often deliberately aged or weathered. Official explanations vary. Some postulate that the statues darkened over centuries due to candle smoke. Others suggest they were intentionally carved with dark features to reflect ancient representations of fertility goddesses or even the Egyptian Isis. However, beneath the layers of incense and theological interpretations lies something more precise. Some of these Madonnas were not merely observed. They were, more curiously, actively guarded. Consider the shrine at Le Puy-en-Velay, situated on a volcanic outcrop in southern France, a site of pilgrimage since pre-Christian times. Beneath the cathedral lies a series of crypts and sealed chambers. In the 17th century, during renovations, workers unearthed an ossuary filled with knightly bones, all bearing marks similar to those utilized by the Knights Templar. The local bishop quietly ordered their reinterment, but not before a Jesuit historian made a sketch of a signet ring found among the remains. That ring bore the sigil of the Red Cross, strikingly similar to the one inscribed in blood on the original papal arrest orders of 1307. Here is where the narrative becomes more peculiar. The shrine has never been managed directly by the church. It has been under the stewardship of the de Laborde family since the mid-14th century, a minor noble line whose estate has long since diminished, yet whose custodianship of the shrine has never been revoked. Records indicate they pay no tax on the land, possess full autonomy over the site, and, most mysteriously, receive an annual stipend from a fund established by the Brotherhood of the Star. No official organization bearing that name exists in any known registry. This pattern recurs elsewhere. In Częstochowa, Poland, the Black Madonna of Jasna Gora is reputed to have repelled invasions, healed the sick, and defied both fire and war. However, the monks who tend her, the Pauline Fathers, maintain traditions not entirely accounted for by conventional Catholic rites. One of their older liturgies includes a passage in medieval Occitan, a language more prevalent in southern France than in Poland. The verse speaks of the daughter of the tower and the blood that must never mix. It reads less like a hymn and more like a code. Then there is the case of the Black Madonna of Einsiedeln in Switzerland. She is housed in a Benedictine abbey, with walls so thick they appear designed for defense rather than contemplation. Beneath the altar lies a sealed vault known only as the Archive of Mary. Access is restricted to 3 individuals: the abbot, a designated archivist, and one lay custodian whose name changes every generation and invariably originates from the same family, the von Lensburgs. This family, though no longer titled nobility, has been linked through DNA studies to an extinct branch of Burgundian aristocracy. This same branch, incidentally, held land granted by the last known Templar commandery in the region. Each shrine, each Madonna, appears to bear a subtle fingerprint, a family name, a heraldic echo, a tradition transmitted through whispers. Some of the families involved are obscure. Others, like the Orsinis in Italy or the Montalembert in France, are well known but rarely associated with these specific sacred sites. Yet, all share a distinct reluctance to discuss their custodianship. When questioned, they politely deflect with smiles and phrases such as old family duties or it's always been that way. Some scholars dismiss these patterns as romantic coincidence, suggesting that families guard ancient shrines simply because their ancestors did, not due to some inherited secret. But then, what accounts for the pervasive secrecy, for the undeniable continuity? And why do so many of these families trace distant links to either the Templars or to those who afforded them shelter? There is another detail, too, one so easily overlooked it almost feels like sleight of hand. Many of these Black Madonnas are carved holding not merely the infant Christ, but an orb, a book, or an unusually shaped chalice. In Montserrat, the Madonna's hand rests upon a globe, said to represent the wisdom of the ages. In Vichy, her child holds a lily with 7 petals, an image rarely encountered in traditional Christian art, but mirrored in certain Rosicrucian manuscripts as a symbol of esoteric knowledge. So, what are these Madonnas guarding? Perhaps they were more than religious statues. Perhaps they served as markers, silent sentinels, emblems for the initiated, indicating that here, within this chapel, the bloodline was remembered, or observed, or protected. One final thread leads us back to France. In a monastery near Chartres, a 15th century monk penned a line in a private devotional journal. The mother watches still. Her face is darkened by sorrow, but her gaze holds the seal. Those who follow the flame will know her not by name, but by blood. It was unsigned, but the handwriting matched a surviving letter from Guillaume de Gisors, an individual believed to have led the final remnants of a Templar inner circle after the trials. Perhaps the bloodline does not merely survive in people. Perhaps it endures in the rituals, in the candles lit before a shadowed face, in the silent oaths whispered not to kings or popes, but to a mother who never speaks and never forgets. The legends are well known. Somewhere, concealed from the gaze of the world, the Holy Grail endures. Not the gleaming chalice of Arthurian romance or cinematic fantasy, but a relic of profound significance, a vessel containing blood, or perhaps a bloodline itself. And if that lineage remained unbroken, if it persisted in secret, then a select few must have been entrusted with its guardianship. This brings us to the final and most elusive participants in this protracted mystery, the custodial families. They are not kings or clergy, but rather discreet houses who never aspired to thrones, seeking only to safeguard something they deemed too sacred for public exposure. These families' names flicker at the periphery of history, never at its core. Their records appear in state archives, not royal decrees. Their properties lie nestled in hills, not bustling capitals. Yet, their interconnections form a strangely perfect circle. We commence in Catalonia, where the House of Montcada, a lineage of ancient wealth and older values, has maintained the same estate since the 13th century. The original estate charter references guardianship of sacred vessels and hospitality for travelers bearing the mark. What mark? A peculiar symbol, a circle intersected by a diagonal line, is carved into several doors on the estate. That identical mark appears, faded and partially obscured, in the corner of a Templar inventory seized during the 1307 arrests. Coincidence? Possibly. However, the Moncada family maintains a private archive that has never been opened to historians. When questioned, they merely state, "It is not ours to share." Another thread leads to the Massimo family of Italy, a noble house with documented ties to both the Vatican and certain esoteric orders. Their coat of arms features a chalice beneath a star, flanked by 2 lions, one facing forward, the other turned away. Local folklore asserts the family once harbored a fugitive monk who arrived with a blood-stained reliquary and a parchment that could unmake kings. This tale, dismissed as fanciful by most scholars, gained unusual credibility in 1996 when renovations uncovered a hidden chamber beneath their chapel. Inside, there was only dust, a rusted sword, and a fresco depicting a woman cloaked in red, holding a golden cup against her chest. The family promptly resealed the chamber, From Spain to France, from Italy to Hungary, the circle continues. In the Loire Valley, the de Vergy family maintains a crumbling chateau surrounded by a forest that locals claim is off-limits after sunset. At the heart of their land lies a spring-fed grotto with a stone altar. The inscription is eroded, but one word remains: sanguis, blood. The family continues to conduct a private ceremony there once a year, attended only by men from 5 other noble houses. Always the same 5, always on the spring equinox. Then there is the Mortimer line of England, long presumed extinct until a genealogist traced a surviving branch to a quiet hamlet in Yorkshire. Their ancestral home contains a mural painted over multiple times. When stripped back during restoration, it revealed a circular motif of 12 cloaked figures surrounding a red banner and a radiant cup. The style dated not to medieval England, but to late Byzantine iconography. The identity of the painter remains unknown. Modern DNA analysis has contributed its share of ambiguity. Certain noble families exhibit genetic markers more common to Levantine populations than their European peers. A handful of private laboratories, discreetly funded by anonymous patrons, have received requests for tests to trace maternal haplogroups that could connect living individuals to first-century Judean lineages. Most laboratories decline, as the implications, understandably, would be explosive. However, perhaps the most compelling evidence derives not from science or architecture, but from observed behavior. These families do not intermarry casually. Their genealogies, where available,